The house is quiet in the particular way that only very large houses become quiet. A silence with architecture of its own, thick behind 50 rooms of drawn curtains and sleeping chandeliers. Somewhere above the second-floor landing, a clock finishes its count and lets the hour go without ceremony. The marble in the front hall holds the cold of the night the way it always has, patient, indifferent, faintly blue in the little light that reaches it from the street lamps outside. You're standing where the hallway narrows, in the part of the house the guests never see. The wallpaper here is plainer, the floorboards are pine instead of oak, worn pale down the centre where feet have passed for 40 years without once being noticed. Your hand rests against a panel that looks, in the dark, exactly like every other panel in the wall. It is not. Somewhere behind it, cut into the space between one room and the next, a stair goes up that is not on any plan a stranger would ever be shown. The air that comes from it smells faintly of plaster dust and cedar, of a coolness that never quite matches the season outside. It has been there longer than anyone currently sleeping in this house has been alive. You do not open it yet. There is no hurry here, and hurry was never really the purpose of a house like this one. Instead, you let your eyes adjust, let the smell settle, let the particular hush of old stone and older secrets wrap itself around you the way it has wrapped itself around everyone who ever learned this hallway existed. Tonight, you're going to walk through the parts of the Gilded Age that were never meant to be seen, the ones drawn in a second, quieter hand, on paper that was never filed with the city. Let your shoulders drop, let your breathing slow to match the houses. There is nowhere else you need to be. It is the autumn of 1891, though the year hardly matters yet. What matters is the house, and the house is any of a dozen houses that lined Fifth Avenue in those years, limestone fronts rising 4 and 5 stories above the street, each one built in a hurry of new money trying to look like old money, each one containing, somewhere behind its public rooms, a second architecture that almost nobody who admired the facade would ever learn existed. You have come to think of these houses the way a physician thinks of a body, 2 systems layered one over the other. There is the visible house, the one built for looking at. Marble stairs that turn in slow, generous curves. Ballrooms with ceilings painted to resemble a sky that never quite rains. Dining rooms long enough to seat 40, tables set with silver that took a footman the better part of a morning to polish. This is the house that appears in the newspapers, the house that guests are shown, the house whose photographs will end up a century later in a museum catalogue captioned with a family name and a date. And then there is the other house, the one built into the walls of the first, invisible unless you know precisely where to press. Corridors no wider than a person's shoulders, run between the studs of a wall that looks, from either side, entirely solid. Stairs that climb 3 floors without a single window, lit only by small gas jets turned low, used by people whose names never appeared on any guest list. Doors disguised as bookcases, as panelling, as the seam between 2 pieces of moulding. This is the house that never appears anywhere, because it was never meant to. You should understand, before we go further, that this second architecture was not in itself scandalous. Every great house of the period contained one. It existed for the plainest of reasons. A household with 30 servants cannot function if those 30 people are constantly crossing paths with the family they serve. A butler carrying soup should not have to squeeze past a debutante on her way to dress for dinner. A chambermaid changing linens should not be visible from the drawing room where a mother is receiving callers. The unseen house was, first and always, a machine for making service invisible, so that comfort could appear to produce itself. But architecture built to hide one thing can be made, very quietly, to hide almost anything. And the men who designed these houses, the same handful of firms working the same 8 or 10 blocks of Manhattan and the same stretch of cliffside in Newport, understood this better than anyone. They drew the visible rooms for the husbands, who paid the bills and cared, mostly about how the house would be photographed. And in the margins of those same drawings, in a smaller hand on paper that rarely survived past the final building permit, some of them drew something else, a stair, a closet with a false back, a passage that connected a lady's dressing room not to the nursery, as the plans on file with the city would suggest, but to a servant's corridor 2 floors below, and from there, quietly, to the street. Nobody asked why. That was, in a sense, the entire point of the arrangement. An architect who could be trusted to build such a thing, and never speak of it afterward, became indispensable to a certain kind of client in a way no amount of marble could achieve. And so a small, particular trade grew up alongside the grand and public one, the trade of building houses that lied a little, on purpose, to the very people who thought they owned every room in them. You are not here tonight to judge any of this. There is no need. The people who lived inside these walls have been gone for well over a century, their scandals settled into paragraphs and footnotes, their houses mostly demolished, replaced by apartment towers or, occasionally, preserved as museums where a docent will walk you past the public rooms and never once mention the ones behind them. You are here simply to walk the second house, slowly, room by room, corridor by corridor, and let the story of the men who built it and the women who used it carry you gently towards sleep. Let your eyes close if they haven't already. The gaslight in the passage ahead is turned low, the way it always was, low enough to find your footing, too low to be seen from any window. Somewhere below you, a clock is still finishing its hour. Follow the sound of it and let it lead you in. The house that watched itself. Every great house of the Gilded Age was built around a single unspoken problem. How does a family live in full view of servants without ever quite seeing them? The solution, worked out over decades by architects on both sides of the Atlantic, was to build two houses inside one set of walls and to make sure the two never touched except at moments the family chose. You can still feel this if you visit one of the surviving mansions today. The public rooms are wide, high-ceilinged, generous with light. The service corridors, tucked behind them, are narrow enough that two people must turn sideways to pass, lit by small windows set high in the wall, or by no windows at all. The contrast is not an accident of budget. It is the entire design philosophy made visible in wood and plaster. At the Elms in Newport, built for a coal magnate and his wife at the turn of the century, an entire hidden hallway runs along the family's private quarters, allowing them to move from room to room without ever crossing paths with a guest who might be wandering the public corridor a few feet away. It is a small thing, a single hallway, and yet it tells you everything about how these houses were meant to be lived in. Privacy was not assumed. Privacy had to be built. The same logic multiplied through every level of a great house. Backstairs ran parallel to front stairs, often for the entire height of the building, so that a maid carrying an armload of linens never needed to pass a guest on the main staircase. Dumbwaiters threaded through the walls between kitchen and dining room, carrying food up through a shaft no wider than a large trunk, so that no one at the table would ever see the labour that produced the meal in front of them. Bells connected every room to a board in the servants' hall below, each one numbered, each number known by heart to a housekeeper who could tell, from the particular rhythm of a ring, which room needed what and how urgently. You begin to understand, walking through this, that the family who lived in the visible rooms were not entirely in control of their own house. They moved through spaces designed to make comfort appear spontaneous, as though warm rooms and ready meals and turned-down beds simply occurred, the way weather occurs without any visible cause. The cause was 30 or 40 people, working 12 and 14-hour days, whose entire professional skill lay in being present exactly when needed and invisible every other moment. This required, of course, an enormous amount of architecture that no one outside the household ever saw. Servants' staircases were narrower than a single stride, turning in tight spirals to save space, painted a plain grey or left as bare wood, utterly unlike the marble treads a few feet away on the other side of the wall. Corridors doubled back on themselves at odd angles, following the logic of function rather than the logic of proportion that governed the rooms meant to be admired. A visitor shown only the front of such a house would have no idea, standing in the ballroom, that a maze of narrow hallways ran directly behind the wall at her back, busy at that very moment with footmen carrying trays. The architects who specialised in these houses became, in a sense, specialists in two entirely different disciplines practised at once. The first discipline was the one everyone recognised: proportion, ornament, the correct historical reference for a cornice or a column, the particular shade of gilding that would read as tasteful rather than vulgar in the newspapers the following morning. The second discipline, practised almost in secret even from most of the profession, was the engineering of invisibility. How do you move 40 people through a house all day without a single one of them ever appearing in a photograph? It is worth pausing here on the sheer scale of what this required. The breakers, built for the Vanderbilt family in Newport in the mid-1890s, contained 70 rooms across 5 floors, and of those 70, more than 30 were reserved entirely for the people who kept the house running. Boiler rooms below street level, laundries with their own ventilation, built to carry steam and the smell of starch away from the family's part of the house entirely. Underground tunnels connecting outbuildings to the main structure, so that coal and supplies could arrive and be carried in without ever crossing the lawn in view of a window. None of this, on its own, was secret in any scandalous sense. It was simply how a household of that size functioned, and any architect worth his fee understood that the invisible half of the house mattered as much as the visible half, perhaps more, because a house where the servants' movements were poorly planned would announce its own labour constantly, breaking the illusion the family was paying for. But once an architect had built the vocabulary for making people disappear inside a wall, that vocabulary could be borrowed for other purposes. A passage built to carry a housemaid unseen from the 3rd floor to the laundry could, with only a slight adjustment to its endpoints, carry someone else entirely, and for reasons that had nothing to do with linens. You should picture, for a moment, the particular quiet of these corridors at night, after the last guest had gone home and the last lamp in the public rooms had been turned down. The service passages did not go dark. A skeleton staff still moved through them, banking fires, checking that doors were locked, carrying the last of the evening's dishes down to a kitchen that never entirely slept in a house of this size. If you had stood, at 2 a.m, in one of these narrow hallways, you would have heard footsteps in both directions, some belonging to people whose presence was entirely ordinary, and, in a small number of houses, 1 or 2 that were not. This is the world you are walking into tonight, not the ballrooms and the newspaper photographs, but the plainer hallway behind them, where the real architecture of the era did its quietest work. It is a world built almost entirely out of discretion, a house designed floor by floor to know things and say nothing. The men who drew these plans rarely spoke of this second discipline in public. Their published work, the buildings that made their names, was always the visible half, the marble and the gilding, and the grand staircase photographed for the society pages. The service corridors, the hidden stairs, the panels that opened onto passages no wider than a coat closet. These appeared on working drawings only, filed away in an architect's private office, and in many cases destroyed once the building was complete, their existence surviving only in the memory of the handful of people who had walked them. It is this quieter set of drawings and the man who kept them longest that we are going to follow tonight. Let the narrow hallway settle around you. Let the sound of the house, its pipes, its distant clock, its very old patience, become the only sound you're listening for. Somewhere ahead of you, a gas jet is burning low, exactly bright enough to see the next few feet of floor and no further. That is enough. It was always enough for the people who built their careers walking passages like this one, and it will be enough for you tonight, as you follow the corridor deeper into the house and further from the world that only ever saw the front of it. Consider, for a moment, the ordinary working day of a footman in a house of this size, since it will help you understand why these corridors were built the particular way they were built. He rose before dawn, often as early as 5 a.m, to lay fires in the family's rooms before anyone woke to feel the cold. He carried water, polished silver, dressed in livery that changed depending on the hour and the occasion, and moved, all day, along routes chosen specifically so that his presence would register to any family member he passed, as no more noticeable than a draft under a door. The architecture that made this possible was not a single clever trick, but an entire accumulated grammar, refined over decades by builders who had learned, through trial and complaint, exactly how a house needed to be organised if its labour was to remain invisible. A backstair could not simply exist. It had to arrive at precisely the right point on each floor, close enough to a bedroom door to be useful, far enough from the main corridor that a guest glancing down the hall would never think to wonder where it led. A pantry had to connect to a dining room by the shortest possible route, because every extra second a dish spent travelling was a second in which its heat and the entire illusion of effortless abundance began to fade. Even sound was a matter of architecture in these houses. Halls between service passages and public rooms were often built thicker than structurally necessary, not to bear additional weight, but to muffle the particular noise of labour, the clatter of a dropped tray, the low murmur of servants coordinating an evening service, so that a guest standing in the drawing room a few feet away would hear nothing but the ordinary hush of a well-run home. Floors in the servants' corridors were sometimes laid with a slightly softer wood, chosen deliberately because it absorbed the sound of hurried footsteps more readily than the hardwood used in the rooms the family occupied. You begin to see, walking this hallway, that the entire house was in some sense an instrument tuned for a single purpose, the production of an appearance. Not falsehood exactly, since the comfort a family enjoyed was real enough, the fires genuinely warm, the meals genuinely fresh, but the appearance that this comfort arose from nowhere, that a house simply provided such things the way a garden provides shade, required an enormous, continuous, carefully hidden labour to sustain, and every corridor you're walking tonight was built specifically to keep that labour just out of sight. It is worth remembering too that the people who moved through these hidden passages every day were not abstractions. They had names, families of their own, ambitions and exhaustions no different from anyone else's, and a working life that this second architecture shaped as thoroughly as it shaped the family's more visible one. A housemaid's entire day could be mapped along these narrow routes, floor to floor, room to room, her movements as choreographed and as invisible, by design, as the movements of the family she served. Consider, too, the training that produced this invisibility, since it did not occur naturally in any new servant, however willing. A housemaid's first weeks in a great house were spent almost entirely learning the particular choreography of not being seen, which corridors to use at which hours, how to enter a room to lay a fire without disturbing a sleeper, how to carry herself so that her presence registered, if it registered at all, as no more than the ordinary hush of a well-run home settling into its evening quiet. Senior servants trained juniors in this choreography with the same patient rigour a dancing master might bring to a debutante's first season, correcting a footstep here, a held breath there, until the movement became instinct rather than effort. This training extended even to posture and gaze. A servant who happened to cross paths with a family member in a shared corridor was expected to lower her eyes, flatten herself against the nearest wall, and wait, motionless, until the family member had passed. A small daily ritual of self-erasure repeated dozens of times across a single working day. It cost something, this constant practiced invisibility, a toll no household account ever measured, paid quietly by the very people whose labour made the visible household possible at all. And yet within this same choreography of invisibility lived its own small compensations, rarely acknowledged but real enough to the people who lived them. A service corridor was, whatever its narrowness, also a place free from a family's direct supervision, a space where a housemaid and a footman might exchange an unguarded joke, a moment's rest against a wall, a fragment of ordinary human conversation that the household's careful architecture, built to erase servants from a family's awareness, incidentally also sheltered from the family's constant observation. The same walls that hid them also, in this narrow and accidental way, briefly freed them. The physical wear these hidden corridors show, in the handful of surviving examples preservationists have since studied, tells its own quiet story. Floorboards worn smooth in a narrow track down the centre, decades of hurried footsteps following the same efficient line, fingerprints, impossible to see now but once surely present, worn into the exact spot on a panel where 100 different hands pressed to swing it open. A house holds the memory of its own labour in these small physical traces long after the people who performed it have been forgotten by name. You might wonder, walking this passage, how many hundreds of individual servants passed through corridors exactly like this one across the whole of the Gilded Age, in how many hundreds of houses just like this one, each of them carrying trays and linens and quiet, private thoughts of their own, through walls built specifically to make sure no one on the other side ever had to think about them at all. It is a very large number, uncountable now, and it is worth letting that scale settle for a moment before we move further into the house. Notice, too, the particular economy of light in these passages, since gas and later electric fixtures were installed here at a fraction of the density found in the rooms the family occupied, a deliberate cost-saving measure that had the secondary effect of making the entire service half of the house perpetually dimmer, perpetually more shadowed, a visual as well as spatial demotion built into the very wiring. A servant's eyes, over years of work in these underlit corridors, adjusted to a permanent dimness that the family, moving always through brightly lit rooms, never had reason to share or even notice. This asymmetry of light is worth carrying with you as we continue, since it captures something the rest of this story will return to again and again: an entire second world, built alongside the first, calibrated in every particular, light, sound, space, comfort, to remain slightly lesser, slightly more constrained, so that the first world could shine by comparison, unaware of what its own brightness had cost. Let this last detail settle before we move on. An entire second civilization, 30 or 40 people strong, living and working within the exact same walls as the family whose comfort they sustained, visible to one another constantly and to the family almost never. It is this civilization you're walking through now, and it will accompany you quietly through every room that follows. This is the world the second architecture was built to sustain, and it is the world you're walking through now, patiently, without hurry, letting each detail settle before the next one arrives. There will be more to see before the night is through, but for now, simply notice the particular quality of this passage, its narrowness, its plainness, the low light that asks nothing of you except that you keep walking slowly toward whatever comes next. Consider one more detail before we leave this corridor behind: the annual ritual, observed in nearly every great house of the period, of a single day each spring when the family would tour the servants' quarters and service passages, ostensibly to inspect their upkeep, in practice a kind of ceremonial reversal in which the invisible half of the house was briefly, formally made visible before returning the following morning to its ordinary unseen state. Servants prepared for this day as carefully as for any grand reception, scrubbing corridors that were otherwise cleaned only for function rather than display. A strange one-day inversion of the household's entire usual logic. The passage narrows slightly here, where the original builders economized on space, and you should let your own pace narrow with it, slower now, more deliberate, matching the particular patience this corridor has always demanded of the people who walked it. Breathe with the house a moment longer before we walk further, in through one door, out through another, the whole slow architecture of this evening still just beginning to unfold around you. It is worth remembering that a house of this scale employed not only the visible staff of footmen and housemaids, but an entire second layer of tradespeople, who entered only rarely, chimney sweeps arriving before dawn twice a year, ice deliverymen using a separate cellar entrance entirely, piano tuners admitted through the service door and escorted directly to the music room without passing through a single space the family considered their own. Each of these rare visitors followed routes worked out with the same careful attention as the daily paths of permanent staff, the house's second architecture extending its logic even to people who set foot inside it only a handful of times each year. It is worth one final observation before we move forward, that this entire second architecture, for all its careful engineering, was built by the very same craftsmen who built the visible house, men equally skilled at both kinds of work, equally invisible in their own way, to the family whose comfort their labour sustained in every direction at once. The man who drew in two hands. His name, for the purposes of this story, was Thomas Calloway, and if you searched for him in the architectural histories of the period, you would find him mentioned only in passing, a junior partner at a respectable but unremarkable firm, credited with a handful of townhouses that no longer exist and a country house in the Hudson Valley that burned in 1931. History, as it is usually written, had no particular interest in him. But history, as it is usually written, is only ever the visible half of the house. Calloway trained the way most architects of his generation trained, not at a university since there were almost none in America offering the degree yet, but as an apprentice in a working office, learning by tracing other men's drawings until his hand could produce a cornice or a staircase without conscious thought. He spent 4 years in this way under a senior partner who cared, above all else, about proportion, about the exact relationship between a window's height and its width, about the discipline of classical ornament applied correctly to an American house that wanted, more than anything, to look as though it had always belonged where it stood. It was careful, unglamorous work, and Calloway was good at it in the unglamorous way that most competent architects were good at it, producing drawings that satisfied a client without ever quite exciting one. He was not, by his own account in the few letters that survive him, an especially inspired designer. What he possessed instead was a kind of patience with detail that made him useful for the parts of a commission other architects found tedious. The plumbing runs, the flue placements, the precise thickness a wall needed to carry both a chimney and, in certain houses, something else entirely. It was this patience, more than any particular flair for ornament, that brought him his first quiet commission of the second kind. A senior partner, overworked and uninterested in the tedious business of routing a service corridor invisibly through 3 floors of a townhouse under construction on Madison Avenue, handed the problem to Calloway almost as a punishment, a way of keeping a junior man busy on unglamorous work while the partners themselves attended to the ballroom ceiling and the choice of marble for the entrance hall. Calloway solved it well. He found a way to run a servant's stair through a space that had originally been allotted to closets, losing almost no usable room in the process, and disguised the entrance to it behind a section of panelling that matched the surrounding walls so precisely that the client's own housekeeper, touring the finished house for the first time, walked past it twice before a footman showed her where to press. This small, unglamorous triumph did not make Calloway famous. It made him, within the narrow circle of contractors and clients who noticed such things, useful in a very particular way. Word travelled slowly in that world, from one household to another, carried by housekeepers comparing notes, by contractors mentioning almost as an aside that the young man from the Madison Avenue firm had a gift for making a passage disappear into a wall. It was the kind of reputation that never appeared in a newspaper and never needed to. By the late 1880s, Calloway had begun receiving commissions that arrived through no official channel at all, letters addressed to him personally rather than to his firm, requesting a private consultation on what the letter would describe, vaguely, as a matter of household convenience. He learned to recognise the tone of these letters quickly. They rarely mentioned money in the first paragraph. They rarely stated in plain language what was actually wanted. They spoke instead of privacy, of the particular needs of a large household, of a wish to discuss the plans somewhere other than his usual office. You should understand that there was nothing inherently illicit in any of this, not at first. The earliest of these private commissions were exactly what they appeared to be. A mother wanting a discreet passage between the nursery and her own bedroom, so she could reach a sick child at night without waking the entire house. A husband wanting his study connected directly to a side entrance, so that business associates arriving after hours would not need to be announced through the main hall where a dinner party might still be in progress. Small, practical requests, the kind any competent architect might reasonably be asked to solve. But Calloway noticed over the years that the requests grew steadily more particular, and that the person making them was, with increasing frequency, not the husband who had commissioned the house at all. It was the wife, arranging to meet him in a downstairs parlour while her husband was at his club, describing a need for privacy in language that grew, letter by letter, season by season, a little less concerned with sick children and a little more concerned with something she never named outright, and that Calloway, out of a professional instinct he could not entirely explain even to himself, learned never to ask about. This is perhaps the first thing worth understanding about the man at the centre of tonight's story. He was not, by temperament, a romantic or a schemer. He was, if anything, almost excessively cautious, the kind of man who kept meticulous records of every commission except the ones that mattered most, and who developed, over a long career, an entire private vocabulary of discretion that appears nowhere in his surviving papers, because it was never meant to appear anywhere at all. He kept 2 sets of drawings for every house of this kind. The first, filed with the city, filed with his firm, shown to any client who asked, depicted the house as everyone believed it to be, service corridors running where service corridors were expected to run, closets exactly as deep as a closet ought to be. The second set existed only in a single portfolio, kept at his own lodgings rather than his office, updated in a private shorthand that used no names, only initials and dates, a code that would have meant nothing to anyone who found it, and everything to Calloway himself, who could look at a page of marks that resembled nothing more than a tradesman's tally and recall, instantly, which house it referred to and what particular silence it had been built to protect. It is tempting, telling a story like this one, to imagine the architect as a figure of quiet rebellion, a man deliberately undermining the patriarchal households that employed him. The truth, as far as it can be reconstructed from the fragments that survive, was considerably plainer. Calloway built what he was asked to build, charged a fee that reflected the discretion required, and kept his own counsel, about what any particular passage might eventually be used for. He was, in the truest sense, a professional. His discretion was not a moral position. It was a service, priced accordingly, and delivered without comment. And yet something in the accumulation of these commissions, house after house, season after season, must have changed him, or at least changed how he understood the houses he built. A man who spends 20 years drawing the invisible half of other people's lives begins, inevitably, to see architecture differently than his colleagues do. He stops asking what a room is for and starts asking what a room could also be for, what a wall might be hiding, what a household's public face might be built quite deliberately to obscure. By the time our story properly begins, in the autumn of 1891, Calloway had built perhaps a dozen of these private commissions, scattered across townhouses in Manhattan and summer cottages in Newport, each one known to no more than 3 or 4 living people, and each one, as far as he was aware, still standing exactly as he had left it. Walls closed, panels seated, silence intact. He was 38 years old that autumn, unmarried, living modestly for a man of his growing private income, in 3 rooms above a bookshop on a quiet street he preferred to the fashionable addresses his clients occupied. He kept his own hours, took his meals alone more often than not, and had developed, by then, the particular stillness of a man who has spent a very long time listening carefully to things he is never asked to repeat. His apprenticeship years deserve a little more of your attention, because they explain a great deal about the man he eventually became. The senior partner he trained under, a formal and somewhat distant figure named Josiah Renwick, believed an architect's character was formed as much by what he was forbidden to do as by what he was taught, and enforced throughout Calloway's 4 years in the office, a rule that no drawing ever left the building bearing the junior draftsman's name, however much of the actual design work had been his. Calloway spent those years producing plans that other men signed, watching buildings rise from his own careful lines, while the credit, and very often the client's gratitude, settled entirely on someone else. It would be easy to imagine this arrangement as a source of quiet resentment, and perhaps, in some private corner of himself, it was. But what it produced, more visibly, was a man entirely comfortable with invisible authorship, someone who had already learned, years before his first private commission, that the satisfaction of solving a difficult problem did not require public acknowledgement to feel complete. This is, in its way, the exact temperament the trade of hidden rooms would eventually demand of him. The evenings during those apprentice years were his only truly private time, and he spent a great many of them at the drafting table in his rented room, working through problems of his own devising rather than problems assigned to him by the firm. He was particularly drawn, even then, to the puzzle of concealment for its own sake, sketching, in a private notebook that predates any of his professional commissions, dozens of theoretical mechanisms for hiding a doorway inside an ordinary wall, false bookcases, panels that pivoted on a central axis, sliding sections disguised by matching wallpaper seams. This hobby might easily have remained just that, a private amusement with no practical outlet, had it not been for the particular circumstances of his first commission on Madison Avenue, which handed him, almost by accident, the opportunity to apply years of private sketching to a genuine and paying problem. It is worth noting how much of what became Calloway's defining trade grew not from any grand ambition, but from this quiet coincidence, a tedious assignment nobody else wanted, met by a young man who happened to have spent years, entirely without professional purpose, thinking about exactly this kind of problem. By the time he reached his late 30s, this private fascination had become, without any dramatic turning point his surviving papers record, simply his life's actual work, conducted alongside and beneath the more visible architecture that paid his official bills. He had grown skilled enough that he rarely needed his old notebook of sketches anymore, the mechanisms of concealment now living in his hands and his instincts rather than on any page, each new commission a variation on principles he had long since mastered. It is worth noting how carefully Calloway maintained the separation between his 2 professional lives, since the discipline this required was, in its own quiet way, as impressive as any single hidden panel he ever built. He kept separate hours for the 2 kinds of work, reserving his mornings for the ordinary business of his firm, drafting townhouses and reviewing contractors' estimates, and his afternoons, when a private commission required his attention, for the quieter and more particular work that never appeared on any office schedule. Colleagues at his firm, questioned decades later by the rare researcher who stumbled across his name, recalled him only as a diligent, somewhat reserved man who kept to himself and left the office promptly at midday on certain, unremarkable Tuesdays and Fridays, never once suspecting where those afternoons actually led. This double life, sustained across 3 decades without a single recorded lapse, required a temperament that went beyond mere carefulness into something closer to a genuine gift for compartmentalization, an ability to hold 2 entirely separate professional identities in mind at once without ever allowing either to bleed into the other. It is the same gift in a smaller way that every one of his clients needed to cultivate in their own lives, the capacity to be, within the space of a single afternoon, both the woman the household believed her to be and the considerably more private person she became behind a door only she and Calloway knew existed. It is also worth noting the sheer physical stamina this double life required of Calloway as he aged. A younger man might manage 2 full professional identities without particular strain, but Calloway maintained this same demanding schedule well into his 50s, rising early for his firm's ordinary business, reserving afternoons for the quieter work, often returning to his own drafting table late into the evening to update the private shorthand of his second ledger before the day's details could fade from memory. It was by any measure an exhausting way to practice 2 careers at once, and it likely contributed, in some measure the record cannot precisely confirm, to the decline in his health that eventually forced his retirement. There is a particular letter among Calloway's surviving personal correspondence, written to his younger son many years later and preserved by chance among family papers, in which he offers, in the guise of general career advice, what reads unmistakably as a reflection on his own 2-track professional life. He writes that a man may build a considerable reputation on work no one ever sees, and that such a reputation, invisible as it is to the wider world, can still be the truest measure of a life well spent, so long as the man himself never loses track of its value. His son, by every account, took the advice as generic fatherly wisdom, never suspecting the considerably more specific experience that had produced it. Let his patience rest with you a moment longer before we move forward. A man who spent 4 years drawing buildings under someone else's name, and 30 more years building rooms no one would ever be told he had built, understood something about quiet, careful work that this whole story depends on. That value does not require witness to be real. It was in this stillness, on an ordinary afternoon in October, that a letter arrived at his lodgings, unsigned, requesting a private meeting to discuss a matter of household convenience, at an address he recognized immediately as belonging to one of the wealthiest families on Fifth Avenue. He would remember, years later, that the letter smelled faintly of lavender, and that he had known, before he had finished reading it, that this particular commission would be unlike any that had come before it. It is worth remembering, finally, that Calloway kept no photograph of himself that survives in any archive, no portrait commissioned, no likeness preserved beyond a brief physical description in a single surviving letter. A man of middling height, brown hair greying early, eyes that a former colleague described only as watchful. Even his own appearance in the end resisted the kind of documentation that made lesser men of his era so thoroughly recoverable to history. There is nothing more to add about the man himself for now, except to notice how completely his story has already prepared you for the one that follows, a careful builder of doors, waiting quietly for the client who would need one most. Let his name settle quietly into memory now, Thomas Calloway, ordinary by every outward measure, extraordinary only in the one respect no one around him ever knew to notice. It is worth adding that Calloway's private notebook of early sketches, the one he kept as a young apprentice working through mechanisms of concealment for his own amusement, survived among his papers and was eventually donated, along with the rest of his estate's modest archive, to the same historical society that holds so much of the material this story depends upon. A researcher examining it decades later noted, with evident surprise, how fully formed his particular genius already appears in those earliest pages, hinges and pivots and disguised seams sketched with a confidence that seems, in retrospect, almost prophetic of the career that would eventually grow from it. If you enjoy listening to sleep stories like this, subscribe. I post stories like this weekly, and it costs you nothing but a moment whenever you're ready to let the next one find you. The House on Fifth Avenue. The Hartwell mansion, when it was completed in the spring of 1889, occupied nearly a full block of Fifth Avenue, a limestone facade rising 4 stories above a raised entrance, approached by a shallow flight of steps flanked by bronze lamps that burned all night, every night, whether or not anyone was expected. It had been built for Charles Hartwell, whose fortune came from freight and shipping, and whose wife, Margaret, had overseen most of the interior decisions while her husband occupied himself, almost entirely, with the business of the fortune itself. You should picture the house the way its architect, not Calloway, but the senior partner of a much grander firm, intended it to be seen. A visitor arriving for an evening reception would pass beneath the bronze lamps, through a vestibule floored in marble imported from a quarry outside Rome, into an entrance hall 2 stories high, its ceiling painted with a scene the newspapers described, with a particular breathlessness reserved for such things, as an allegory of commerce and abundance. The grand staircase rose from the centre of this hall in a single, unbroken curve, wide enough for 2 women in full evening dress to pass without touching skirts. Beyond the entrance hall lay the rooms the Hartwells were known for, a ballroom finished in white and gold that could hold 400 guests, a dining room panelled in walnut brought from England, a music room with acoustics good enough that visiting singers occasionally remarked on them, unprompted, which was considered in that world the highest possible compliment. Every surface had been chosen for what it would communicate to a stranger standing in it for the first time, and what it communicated consistently was that the Hartwells belonged exactly where they stood, whatever the newspapers might occasionally suggest about the newness of the money that had built the place. Margaret Hartwell was 34 years old when the house was completed, the daughter of a modestly prosperous Boston family who had married Charles Hartwell 12 years earlier, in a match her own mother had described, in a letter that survives among family papers as sensible rather than romantic. It was not an unkind description. It was, by the standards of the world Margaret had been raised in, simply accurate. Charles Hartwell was 20 years her senior, prosperous, respected and largely absent, a man whose attention was given almost entirely to his business, and in the evenings, to his club, where he dined most nights among men whose conversation revolved around freight rates and railroad shares. You should not imagine Margaret Hartwell as an unhappy woman in any dramatic sense. Her life, viewed from the outside, was one that thousands of women in her position would have considered enviable, and in most material respects, it was. She had, by the time the house was finished, 3 children, a household staff of nearly 30, a wardrobe replenished each season from Paris, and a social calendar that filled every afternoon and most evenings from October through May. What she did not have, and what the house itself, for all its marble and gilding, could not provide, was very much privacy. This was not a complaint particular to Margaret Hartwell. It was, in a sense, the defining condition of a woman in her position. A great house of this period was, first and always, a stage, and the lady of such a house was its principal performer, expected to be visible, gracious and available almost every waking hour, to servants requiring instruction, to children requiring attention, to callers arriving without notice between the hours of 2 and 5, to her husband's business associates when they dined at the house, to her husband himself, whose comings and goings she was expected to accommodate without complaint or, ideally, without comment of any kind. The house had been built, like every house of its kind, with a second architecture behind the first, servants' stairs and corridors running invisibly through the walls, and Margaret, who had overseen most of the decoration, understood this second architecture better than most women of her class, having spent the better part of 2 years reviewing plans with the architects and contractors. Her husband had little patience to consult himself. She knew where every hidden stair in the house led. She knew, better than her own housekeeper in some cases, which panels concealed which passages, because she had approved each one personally, initialing the drawings in a study that Charles rarely entered. What she noticed, reviewing those plans, session after session, through the 2 years of the house's construction, was that every hidden passage in the house had been built for someone else's convenience. A stair for the nursemaid, running discreetly from the 3rd floor to the kitchen, a corridor for the footman, connecting the dining room to the pantry without crossing the main hall, a passage for Charles himself, allowing him to reach his study from the side entrance without passing through the reception rooms when he returned late from his club, smelling, as he often did by then, of cigars and brandy. There was no passage in any of these plans built for her. This was not in itself unusual. It had simply never occurred to the architects or to Charles, or for a long while to Margaret herself, that the lady of the house might have any particular need for a door that led somewhere her husband did not already know about. A wife's movements, in the world Margaret Hartwell occupied, were not generally considered private in the way a husband's were. She was expected to be found whenever she was wanted in one of a small number of predictable rooms, and the house had been built without anyone quite intending it to make sure this remained true. It is difficult to say precisely when the thought first occurred to her that a house so thoroughly built around the principle of invisibility for servants and convenience for her husband might, with a little care, be made to offer her something of the same. Perhaps it happened gradually, over the 2 years of watching plans go past her desk, each one solving someone else's problem of movement, until the absence of any solution to her own became, itself, a kind of presence she could no longer quite ignore. What is known, from the letter that survives, dated the second week of October 1891, roughly 2.5 years after the house's completion, is that Margaret Hartwell wrote, in her own hand, to a young architect named Thomas Calloway, whose name she had heard mentioned once in passing, by a housekeeper from a family in Newport, in a tone that suggested he was the sort of man who could be trusted with a delicate matter, and who would not require it explained to him in any greater detail than his client wished to provide. The letter was brief. It requested a private consultation, at a time and place to be arranged separately from any correspondence with her husband's office, regarding a matter of household convenience that Margaret Hartwell described only as concerning her own particular comfort within a house that had, in every other respect, been built to her most exacting specifications. You should not read into this letter more than it contains. Margaret Hartwell was not, at the moment she wrote it, planning anything so dramatic as the story's later chapters might suggest. She wanted, as far as any surviving evidence indicates, something considerably smaller and more modest than legend would eventually make of it. A room, or a passage to a room, that existed outside the accounting her husband's household kept of her every hour. A place she could go and not be found for an afternoon without explanation, without a servant reporting her whereabouts to anyone at all. It was a small thing to ask, and it would become, in Calloway's hands, a considerably larger undertaking than either of them anticipated that October, when the letter first reached his lodgings above the bookshop, and he read it twice by lamplight, recognizing, as he had learned to recognize, the particular tone of a client who wanted something the house was never built to provide. It is worth understanding a little more about the 2 years Margaret spent overseeing the house's construction, since they shaped, in ways she may not have fully recognized at the time, the particular longing that eventually led her to write to Calloway. Charles Hartwell had given her at the project's outset what he considered a generous latitude, full authority over decoration, colour, fabric, the choice of nearly every ornamental detail a visitor would eventually admire. What he had not given her, because it would not have occurred to either of them to frame it this way, was any authority over the house's fundamental logic, the placement of rooms, the routes by which people moved through them, the underlying grammar of who was permitted to go where and when, and without explanation. She spent those 2 years, then, in a curious position, deeply knowledgeable about a structure she did not in the end control, capable of choosing the exact shade of gold leaf for a ceiling border, while having no say whatsoever in whether the house contained a single room built around her own convenience rather than someone else's. This was not, at the time, a grievance she could have easily named, since the entire language available to her for describing a house's purpose assumed, without question, that the family's convenience meant her husband's convenience, her children's convenience, her guests' convenience, in that order, with her own needs folded somewhere into the general category of a household running smoothly. It was only gradually, reviewing session after session of plans that solved everyone's movement through the house except her own, that the shape of what was missing became visible to her, the way a photograph slowly resolves in a darkroom tray, indistinct at first, then unmistakable. By the house's completion in the spring of 1889, she understood the omission clearly enough to feel it as an omission, though it would take another 2.5 years, and the accumulated weight of 100 afternoons with no door of her own to close before she acted on that understanding. Her marriage to Charles, meanwhile, had settled into the particular equilibrium common to matches of convenience that neither party especially regretted, a working partnership conducted with courtesy and a genuine, if limited, affection, sustained by shared children, and a shared social position rather than by any deep intimacy of temperament. Charles was not unkind to her by any account that survives, and Margaret does not appear, in her own private writing, to have considered herself unhappy in any dramatic sense. What she felt more precisely was a kind of narrowness, a life conducted entirely within rooms someone else had designed for someone else's convenience, however comfortable those rooms otherwise were. It is worth understanding what an ordinary day actually looked like for a woman in Margaret's position, since the word narrowness can otherwise sound abstract. She woke at 7, dressed with her maid's assistance in a sequence of garments that took the better part of an hour to arrange correctly. Breakfast was taken with the children before their tutors arrived. The late morning was given over to correspondence and instructions to Mrs. Doyle regarding the day's household management. Early afternoon brought calls, either receiving them or paying them, a rigid social choreography that dictated which days were appropriate for which type of visit, and precisely how long a caller might reasonably stay before overstaying her welcome. Evenings, when the family dined at home, required a change of dress and a period of conversation with Charles that rarely extended beyond an account of his day and a brief general inquiry into hers. Within this schedule, replicated with only minor variation across nearly every day of the year, there existed almost no interval that belonged to Margaret alone, unaccounted for, unstructured by someone else's expectation of her. Even her hours of leisure, an afternoon's reading, a walk in the small private garden behind the house, were interruptible at any moment by a servant's knock, a child's need, a caller arriving unannounced within the socially sanctioned hours. It was this specific grinding absence of any truly private interval, rather than any single dramatic grievance, that Margaret found herself unable to name clearly even to herself, in the 2 years she spent reviewing her house's plans and noticing again and again that no room within them had been built with this absence in mind. It is worth imagining too the particular quality of Margaret's solitude within this schedule, since solitude and privacy are not quite the same thing, however often they are confused. She was frequently alone in a physical sense, a moment between callers, a quiet hour before dinner, and yet these moments of physical solitude rarely felt private in any meaningful way, since they existed always within a house where a servant might knock at any moment, where her whereabouts were always in principle knowable to anyone in the household who cared to ask. True privacy required not merely an empty room, but a room no one else knew to look for, and it was precisely this distinction, subtle but enormous in its practical consequence, that led her eventually to Calloway's door. It is worth noting too the particular quality of exhaustion this schedule produced, distinct from ordinary physical tiredness. Margaret described it once, in a letter to her daughter written many years later, as a feeling of having performed the same day so many times that she sometimes could not recall, by evening, whether a particular conversation had taken place that afternoon or the afternoon before, each day's careful repetition of duties blurring into the next until the individual days themselves seemed to lose their edges. It is this particular, cumulative blurring, more than any single dramatic grievance, that the hidden room would eventually interrupt, giving her, twice a week, an hour sharp and distinct enough to remember clearly afterward. Hold this image of the young Margaret for a moment, standing over blueprints in a study that was never quite hers, learning the shape of a house that would, in time, teach her exactly what it had failed to give her. He wrote back within the week, proposing a meeting at an address neither the Hartwell household nor his own firm would recognise, a small, unremarkable parlour attached to a milliner's shop 2 streets from the Hartwell mansion, chosen because a lady of Margaret's standing could visit a milliner without occasioning the slightest comment from anyone who might see her enter. It is worth adding too that Margaret's own mother, visiting from Boston during the house's 2nd year of construction, remarked in one surviving letter on how thoroughly her daughter had thrown herself into the project, noting with evident pride that Margaret understood the plans better than the contractor himself. Neither mother nor daughter could have known, reading that letter at the time, how directly this hard-won architectural fluency would eventually serve her. The house waits now, fully built, fully furnished, its grand rooms complete and its one crucial absence not yet addressed, and it is toward that absence patiently that our story turns next. Let the house itself settle into full view now, marble and walnut and gilded ceiling, waiting patiently for the one small addition that will finally make it complete. It is worth noting too that Charles Hartwell's own study, connected as it was to the side entrance he preferred, had been fitted at his explicit request, with a small private washroom entirely his own, a modest convenience that had cost the family barely a second thought during construction, precisely because a husband's need for a private space within his own house was never treated as a request requiring justification in the first place. A meeting behind a milliner's shop. The parlour behind the milliner's shop was small, furnished plainly with 2 chairs and a low table, warmed by a coal fire that had been lit an hour before the appointed time so that the room would already be comfortable when its occupants arrived. Calloway arrived first, as he always did for meetings of this kind, and spent the intervening minutes doing what he always did in an unfamiliar room, noting the placement of the single window, the thickness of the wall it shared with the shop beyond, the sound of the street outside muffled but not entirely absent. Margaret Hartwell arrived at 2:30, dressed plainly for a woman of her position, in a manner clearly chosen to attract no particular attention on the short walk from her carriage. She was, Calloway noted in the private shorthand he kept for such impressions, composed in the way of a woman accustomed to being observed at all times, her movements economical, her expression pleasant and entirely unreadable. She thanked him for coming, seated herself without being asked, and came to the point of the meeting with a directness that Calloway would later describe, in the closest thing to a personal remark that survives among his papers, as unlike any client he had previously worked for. She explained, in careful, measured sentences, that her house had been built with a great deal of consideration for the convenience of nearly everyone who lived and worked within it, except herself. She did not say this bitterly. She said it, Calloway noted, the way a person might describe a minor oversight in an otherwise satisfactory arrangement, a missing coat hook in an otherwise well-appointed cloakroom. She wanted, she said, a room that was entirely her own, reachable, without passing through any space where a servant or her husband might reasonably expect to find her, a room where she could sit for an hour or an afternoon, without her absence being remarked upon by anyone in the household. Calloway asked, as he always asked at this stage of a commission, what the room would be used for. It was a professional question, not a personal one. The answer determined ventilation, lighting, the placement of a chimney if warmth was required, the thickness of walls if silence was the primary concern. Margaret Hartwell considered the question for a long moment, before answering that the room would be used, principally for reading and for correspondence. And, she added, after a pause Calloway noted carefully in his private record of the conversation, for whatever else a person might wish to do in a room where no one could see them. It was, Calloway would reflect later, an answer that told him everything and nothing at once, and he understood from the particular way she had phrased it that she did not yet know herself precisely what the room's fullest use might eventually become. This did not trouble him. He had learned, over a decade of commissions of this kind, that clients rarely arrived with a complete picture of what they were asking for. They arrived instead with an absence they had only recently begun to notice, and the room, once built, tended to fill itself in over time, according to needs that revealed themselves gradually, long after the plasterer had finished his work. He asked to see the house's existing plans, and Margaret Hartwell produced from beneath her cloak a folded set of drawings, the very plans she had reviewed and initialed 2 years earlier during the house's construction, taken without her husband's knowledge from the study where the family's papers were kept. Calloway unfolded them on the low table between the 2 chairs and studied them by the light of the coal fire for the better part of 20 minutes, tracing, with a pencil he had brought for exactly this purpose, the existing network of hidden corridors that already ran through the walls of the house, unused for the most part by anyone except the small number of servants whose duties required them. What he found, as he had half expected to find, was a house already honeycombed with invisible passage, corridors that had been built for laundry and coal, and the discreet movement of servants, running close enough, in several places, to the family's private rooms that a relatively modest alteration, a new panel here, a widened passage there, could connect them to spaces no one currently thought to associate with the lady of the house at all. The particular solution he proposed, sketched in pencil on a fresh sheet that afternoon while Margaret Hartwell watched, involved a small room on the 3rd floor, currently used for storing linens, tucked behind the nursery in a part of the house that received almost no traffic outside the hours when the children were being dressed or put to bed. The room had a single window overlooking an interior light well rather than the street, which meant it could be lit and even warmed without the change being visible from outside the house. And it connected through a passage no wider than a large wardrobe to an existing servant's stair that ran, unused for most of the day, down 2 floors to a side door that opened onto a narrow service alley rather than the avenue itself. A person entering that room from the nursery corridor would find, to all appearances, a locked linen closet. A person who knew where to press, however, would find the back panel of the closet swung inward on a hinge concealed by the moulding, revealing a small room, perhaps 10 feet by 12, that could be furnished as its occupant wished, entirely unknown to the rest of the household. And a person leaving by the stair at the passage's far end could reach the service alley, and from there the avenue itself without a single member of the household observing their departure or return. Margaret Hartwell studied the sketch for a long while in silence, and Calloway, watching her without appearing to watch her, noted an expression he had seen before in clients at this stage of a commission, a kind of careful stillness that he had come to recognise as the particular look of a person realising for the first time that a thing they had wanted without quite admitting it to themselves was, in fact, entirely possible. She asked finally how long the work would take, and whether it could be done without her husband's knowledge. Calloway explained that the linen closet's conversion could be managed, with the right workman and a plausible cover story, over the course of perhaps 3 weeks, timed to coincide with a period when Charles Hartwell would be occupied with business in Chicago, a trip Margaret confirmed, checking a small calendar she kept in her reticule, was already scheduled for the following month. The workmen, Calloway added, would be men he had used before for commissions of this kind, tradesmen who understood, without ever being told directly, that certain jobs were paid at a premium precisely because they would never be discussed afterward, with anyone, under any circumstances. The fee, when Calloway named it, was considerably higher than the cost of materials and labour alone would have suggested, and Margaret Hartwell did not so much as blink at the figure, reaching instead into her reticule and producing without comment a sum in cash sufficient to cover the first half of the work. Calloway would note in his private record of the meeting that she paid with the same unhurried composure she had shown throughout the conversation, the composure of a woman who had clearly given the matter of cost a good deal of thought before ever writing her first letter. They met twice more before the work began, refining the details of the room's furnishing, agreeing on a cover story for the workman's presence, a supposed repair to the nursery's plumbing that would explain the noise and the closed door without inviting any particular curiosity from the household staff. By the end of their third meeting, Calloway had come to understand that Margaret Hartwell was, whatever else might be said of her, an exceptionally careful planner, someone who considered every detail of a scheme before committing to it, and who had clearly been considering the general shape of this particular scheme for a very long time before she ever wrote to him. He left the milliner's parlour that final afternoon with the drawings folded carefully inside his coat, and walked the 2 streets back toward his own lodgings, turning over, as he often did after a meeting of this kind, the question that never quite left him no matter how many times he answered it in his own favour, whether a man who built such rooms bore any responsibility for what eventually happened inside them. He had settled, years earlier, on the answer that satisfied him, that a room was only ever a room, and that what a person did with privacy, once it was given to them, was a matter entirely outside an architect's professional concern. It was a comfortable answer, and it had served him well through a decade of similar commissions. Whether it would continue to serve him through this one he could not yet have said, walking home that October evening with the plans of Margaret Hartwell's hidden room folded against his chest, the ink not yet entirely dry. There is something worth noting about the particular economics of this arrangement, since money moved through these transactions in ways that left almost no trace for later historians to follow. Calloway was never paid by cheque, never by any instrument that would require a bank to record the transaction under a recognisable name. His clients paid in cash, in gold coin on occasion, in small increments spread across the duration of a commission, so that no single withdrawal from a household account would appear unusual to a husband who reviewed the ledgers, or to a bank clerk who might otherwise have wondered why a lady of the house required so substantial a sum on a Tuesday afternoon. Margaret Hartwell, like most of Calloway's clients, drew on a private allowance her husband provided for what he understood to be the ordinary discretionary expenses of a woman in her position, dressmakers and milliners, and the small charitable subscriptions that were considered appropriate to her station. It was a generous allowance, generous enough that Charles Hartwell never thought to itemize it closely, and it was this generosity, more than any deliberate concealment on Margaret's part, that made Calloway's fee possible to pay without ever drawing suspicion. She simply spent a little less on dresses that year, and a little more on something her husband never knew existed at all. There is a particular kind of quiet resourcefulness in this arrangement worth pausing on, the way an entire category of expense her husband assumed to be frivolous, a wife's endless and apparently bottomless appetite for dresses and hats, became, in Margaret's hands, the very mechanism by which she purchased something considerably more substantial than either. It is difficult not to notice the irony. The same social assumption that dismissed women's spending as trivial and unworthy of scrutiny was precisely what made it possible for a woman with sufficient nerve to spend that money on something the household's men would never have sanctioned had they thought to ask what it was actually for. Calloway understood this dynamic well enough that he priced his fees across all 17 commissions in his ledger, specifically within the range a household's discretionary allowance could plausibly absorb without triggering comment, a professional calculation nearly as careful as any structural one he made. A fee too low might suggest an unserious tradesman incapable of the discretion required. A fee too high might force a client into a withdrawal large enough to draw a husband's notice. He settled across most of his career on a figure calibrated with the same precision he brought to a hinge or a stair tread, a number just large enough to guarantee seriousness, just small enough to disappear. It is worth adding a final note on the meeting's practical conclusion, since the details matter to understanding how such arrangements actually functioned. Calloway left the milliner's parlour that afternoon with a signed, unaddressed receipt in his coat pocket, a simple slip of paper acknowledging a sum received for consulting services, a document vague enough to mean nothing to anyone who might later find it, and specific enough to satisfy his own careful bookkeeping. It was, in its way, the perfect artifact of the entire trade, a transaction that had to leave some trace, however faint, and yet could never afford to leave a trace anyone else could read. It is worth adding that Calloway kept, across his entire career, a strict personal rule never to accept partial payment without full payment following within a fixed and reasonable term, a rule that protected him from the particular vulnerability an unpaid debt of this kind might have created, a client who fell behind on payment holding, in effect, a kind of leverage over an architect who very much needed his own silence, protected as much as hers. Every one of the 17 commissions in his ledger shows payment completed in full, a detail that speaks to the careful mutual seriousness with which both architect and client approached these unusual and unusually delicate transactions. Let the two of them sit there a moment longer, architect and client. Plans spread on the low table between them, the fire settling into embers, both of them quietly aware that something had just been agreed to that neither would ever discuss again outside this room. This detail matters because it illustrates something larger about the entire trade Calloway had built his career around. It depended at every step not on outwitting some vigilant system of oversight, but on the simple, structural fact that wealthy men of this period rarely examined the details of what their wives spent money on, so long as the sums remained within an unremarkable range, and the results, whatever they were, never became visible enough to require an explanation. The privacy Calloway sold was purchased in the most literal sense, out of the very inattention that had made its necessity so acute in the first place. It is worth noting too that Calloway always insisted on walking a finished commission's exterior himself, alone, at both midday and midnight, checking that no seam, no unexpected shadow, no telltale variation in the wall surface betrayed, from outside the house, any hint of what lay concealed within. Only once satisfied on both counts would he consider a commission genuinely complete. The plans are folded now, tucked away, and somewhere in the city a small crew of trusted tradesmen is already being quietly assembled, though none of them yet know which house, or which wall, or which particular silence they are about to help build. Let the milliner's parlour grow quiet now, its coal fire burning low, its small part in this story already finished, its two visitors gone their separate ways into the same ordinary evening. It is worth noting too that Calloway maintained a standing rule never to discuss the fee for one commission with any subsequent client, however indirectly, a discipline that protected not only his client's privacy, but the entire structure of trust the trade depended upon. A client who suspected her neighbour had paid less, or more, for similar work, might begin to ask questions Calloway had no interest in answering, and so each negotiation proceeded as though it were entirely without precedent, however many times he had in fact negotiated nearly the same terms before. It is worth one further note on this arrangement, that Calloway never once across 17 commissions and 30 years raised his fee mid-project once a figure had been agreed, understanding that trust, once established at a given price, was worth considerably more to his reputation than any additional sum he might otherwise have extracted from a client who had, by that point, very little leverage left to negotiate with. The weeks of quiet hammering. Charles Hartwell left for Chicago on the 9th of November, taking with him a valet, 2 trunks, and a folder of shipping contracts he intended to review on the train, and the household settled, as it always did during his absences, into a quieter and slightly less formal rhythm, one Margaret had long since learned to appreciate without ever admitting as much to anyone. The workmen arrived the following morning, 3 of them, carrying tool bags and a small quantity of lumber, and were shown by the housekeeper to the 3rd-floor nursery corridor, where she had been told several days earlier that a persistent damp in the linen closet required attention before it spread to the nursery itself. It was a plausible enough story. The house was less than 3 years old, but even new construction on this scale occasionally revealed a flaw, and the housekeeper, a practical woman named Mrs. Doyle who had run the household since its opening, thought nothing further of it, closing the nursery door each afternoon so the children would not be disturbed by the noise, and reporting the work's progress to Margaret each evening in the same brisk, unremarkable tone she used for every other domestic matter. Calloway himself was present for most of the 3 weeks, though never in the guise of an architect. He had introduced himself to the household on the first morning as a plumber's assistant overseeing the repair, a small deception that required nothing more elaborate than a plain coat and a tool bag of his own, and that no one in the household had any particular reason to question. It was, he reflected privately, one of the stranger comforts of his particular trade, that a man dressed as a tradesman became, to a household staff accustomed to tradesmen passing through constantly, almost entirely invisible. The work itself proceeded in careful stages, designed to leave at the end of each day nothing visible that would contradict the cover story. The first week was spent, ostensibly, examining and repairing the supposed damp, work that involved a good deal of noise and very little that anyone glancing into the closet would find suspicious. In truth, this first week was used to open the back wall of the closet, carefully, board by board, revealing the narrow cavity between the nursery wing and the adjoining servants' stair, a space that had existed, empty and unused, since the house's construction, exactly as Calloway's study of the original plans had promised. The second week saw the cavity widened and finished, its rough studs covered with plaster, a small window fitted into the wall facing the light well, glazed with a pane of frosted glass that would admit daylight without permitting anyone in the well below to see clearly into the room. A section of flooring was laid, matching, as closely as the workmen could manage, the boards in the rest of the house, though Calloway noted in his private record that the match would never be perfect to a trained eye, a detail he considered acceptable given that no trained eye was ever expected to see it. The third week was given over to the passage itself, the narrow connecting corridor between the new room and the existing servants' stair 2 floors below, and to the construction of the panel that would conceal the room's entrance from the nursery side. This last piece of work required the most care of all. The panel had to swing freely on a concealed hinge, close with enough precision that no seam would be visible even to someone standing directly in front of it, with a lamp and lock from the room's interior, with a mechanism simple enough that Margaret could operate it herself without instruction, but discreet enough that a curious child or servant, running a hand along the moulding, would feel nothing but smooth, continuous wood. Calloway fitted this final mechanism himself, on the last afternoon of the 3 weeks, working alone in the closet after the other workmen had been dismissed for the day, testing the panel's swing a dozen times, adjusting the hinge fractionally each time until it moved without a sound and closed with a soft, solid click that satisfied him. He stood afterward in the finished room, small and plain, its walls freshly plastered and not yet painted, its single window admitting the last grey light of a November afternoon, and allowed himself, for perhaps the only time in the entire commission, a moment of something close to satisfaction in the work itself, separate from the fee it had earned him. It was, in its finished state, an unremarkable room by any ordinary standard, 10 feet by 12, a single window, a floor that did not quite match the rest of the house, walls that would eventually be painted and furnished according to Margaret Hartwell's own taste. What made it remarkable was entirely a matter of what could not be seen. No door on any plan the city held on file, no entrance visible from either the nursery corridor or the servants' stair it connected to, nothing in the house's official architecture that acknowledged the room existed at all. Margaret visited it for the first time 3 days before her husband's return, slipping away from an afternoon that Mrs. Doyle's household diary records only as her mistress resting in her rooms, a phrase that had, until that week, always meant precisely what it appeared to mean, and that would, from this point forward, occasionally mean something considerably less literal. She spent perhaps an hour in the finished room that first afternoon, Calloway's private record notes, based on a brief final meeting the two held the following week to settle the balance of his fee, during which she described the room, in careful and measured language, as entirely satisfactory. She furnished it herself over the following month, a task that required no particular secrecy, since a lady of the house purchasing furniture, even furniture that never appeared to arrive at any recognisable room in the household inventory, attracted no comment from a staff accustomed to Margaret's occasional and unexplained purchases. A small writing desk, a single armchair, upholstered in a deep green fabric she had chosen, according to a fragment of correspondence with a decorator that survives among unrelated family papers, for reasons she declined to specify. A modest bookshelf, gradually filled with volumes that had nothing in common, except that each one, apparently, was something Margaret Hartwell wished to read without anyone in her household knowing she was reading it. Charles Hartwell returned from Chicago on the last day of November, tired from the journey and satisfied with the contracts he had negotiated, and noticed nothing whatsoever different about his house. This was, in the strictest sense, entirely true. Nothing about the house that he was capable of seeing had changed at all. The marble stairs still curved the same generous arc from the entrance hall, the dining room still seated 40 beneath its walnut panelling. His study still connected, exactly as it always had, to the side entrance he preferred to use when returning late from his club. What had changed existed entirely outside his awareness. A small room behind a linen closet on the 3rd floor, connected by a passage no wider than a wardrobe to a servant's stair he had never once in 3 years of residence had occasion to use, containing a writing desk, a green armchair, and a modest and steadily growing collection of books that his wife read, alone, in a light that came only from a single window, facing an interior well he had never thought to look into. You should sit with this for a moment. The particular strangeness of a house that had, in the space of 3 weeks, become larger than the man who owned it understood it to be. Charles Hartwell believed that November that he possessed a complete and accurate picture of every room in his own home. He did not and would not for a very long time, and the gap between what he believed and what was actually true had been built, quietly and expertly, by a man he had never met and would never learn the name of, working from plans his wife had kept, without his knowledge, in a study he rarely entered. It is worth noting, before we move further into this story, that Margaret Hartwell did not, in these early weeks, use the room for anything her husband would have objected to had he somehow discovered it. She used it largely, exactly as she had described it to Calloway that first afternoon in the milliner's parlour, for reading, for correspondence, for the simple and at the time entirely unremarkable pleasure of sitting alone in a room where no one could find her, for an hour or two, without explanation. That the room's purpose would eventually grow to include a good deal more than reading is a matter we will come to in time. For now, let it remain simply what it was that November, a small plain space, warmed against the coming winter, holding nothing more scandalous than a woman and her books. The 3 workmen who built the room's essential structure, before Calloway's own final and solitary afternoon of fitting the panel mechanism, were men he had used on 4 previous commissions of this kind, a small, informal crew he had assembled over the years specifically for their combination of skill and reliable silence. Their names survive, faintly, in his private ledger, as a set of initials paid a fixed weekly sum regardless of the particular household they were working in, a premium wage that reflected as much as anything the value of their forgetting. One of these men, whose initials appear across nearly every commission in Calloway's ledger from 1885 onward, was a carpenter named for our purposes Samuel, a quiet, exact craftsman who had learned, over years of this particular work, to ask no questions at all about the purpose of any unusual instruction, a hinge set flush enough to vanish, a panel cut to swing on a pivot, rather than a conventional door frame. He treated each commission according to the one fragment of testimony that survives from a descendant who recalled family stories decades later as simply an interesting technical puzzle, the actual use to which the finished work would be put a matter entirely outside his professional curiosity. Samuel's own account of the work, preserved only second-hand through a grandchild's recollection of family stories told at the dinner table decades later, described the particular satisfaction of a hinge fitted so precisely that it made no sound at all, a satisfaction he compared, in the one direct quotation that survives, to the feeling of a lock turning smoothly in cold weather when a lesser mechanism would have stuck. It is a craftsman's pleasure, entirely divorced from any curiosity about the household drama his work might eventually serve, and it suggests something worth remembering about every trade discussed in this story, that skill, pursued carefully enough and long enough, can become its own private reward, regardless of what larger purpose it happens to serve. The 3 weeks of work on the Hartwell room proceeded, in this sense, on two entirely separate tracks that never quite touched. For Margaret, each day's hammering represented the slow, anxious construction of a freedom she had wanted for years. For Samuel and his fellow tradesmen, the same days represented simply another commission, another set of measurements to get exactly right, another problem of angles and clearances to solve with the particular quiet pride of men who took their work seriously regardless of who it was for. The final inspection of the completed room, conducted by Calloway alone on that last November afternoon, included a test that he performed at the end of every commission of this kind, a habit he had developed early in his career and never once skipped. He stood inside the finished room, closed the panel from within, and waited in complete darkness and silence for several minutes, listening for any sound from the nursery corridor beyond, any creak or draught that might betray the room's presence to someone standing on the other side. Only when he was satisfied that the silence was complete did he consider the commission truly finished. The particular smell of fresh plaster and sawdust that filled the nursery corridor through those 3 weeks lingered, according to a brief mention in Mrs. Doyle's diary, for nearly a month afterward, faint enough that the children never remarked on it, but present enough that Margaret herself, passing through the corridor on ordinary business unrelated to the room, would catch it occasionally and feel, each time, a small private thrill of anticipation, the physical residue of construction becoming, for her alone, a kind of secret perfume attached to an entirely different kind of freedom. Let the smell of fresh plaster fade now, the way it always eventually fades, into the ordinary air of a house settling back into its ordinary rhythms, one more room finished, one more secret sealed quietly into the walls. This was, in its way, its own small economy of discretion, running parallel to the one we discussed among household servants, a handful of tradesmen who built their livelihoods on the same premium of silence that Calloway charged his clients, passing a portion of that premium down to the men whose hands actually cut the wood and fitted the hinges. Not one of them, as far as any surviving record indicates, ever spoke publicly of the work, in a trade with no guild, no professional association, no written code of conduct beyond the simple, well-understood fact that a man who talked would never be hired again. It is worth adding one further detail about the room's earliest days. Margaret kept, in a small dish on the writing desk, a handful of dried lavender from the same stem that had, months earlier, scented the letter first announcing her intentions to Calloway, a private and entirely sentimental touch that no one else in the household would ever have reason to notice or question. The room stands finished now, plain and small and entirely her own, waiting only for the winter to properly begin before its first true season of the use. Let November close gently around the finished room, the last of the sawdust swept away, the first quiet Tuesday afternoon still a few days off yet. It is worth noting, too, that the workmen were paid their final wages in a small ceremony of sorts, Calloway meeting each of the 3 men individually rather than together, a habit he maintained across every commission specifically so that no 2 tradesmen could ever compare notes on exactly what they had been paid or exactly what they had built, preserving the same careful compartmentalization that governed every other aspect of his working life. What the household knew and never said. It would be a mistake to imagine that a room like the one built into the Hartwell house could exist for long without at least a few members of the household coming eventually to suspect something. A house of 30 servants is, whatever else it may be, an extraordinarily attentive instrument, its staff trained from their first week of employment to notice details a family member would never think to observe, a door that sticks slightly differently than it used to, a room that is dusted less thoroughly because a housemaid has never actually been permitted to enter it, the particular quality of silence that surrounds a space nobody quite discusses. Mrs. Doyle, the housekeeper who had overseen the household since the house's opening, was exactly this sort of attentive instrument, and it would strain credibility to suggest she never noticed anything unusual about the linen closet on the 3rd floor, its lock a fraction more substantial than the locks on every other closet in the house, its interior, on the rare occasions a housemaid was sent to fetch something from it, arranged with a precision that seemed, to a woman who had managed households for 20 years, faintly at odds with its stated purpose. What Mrs. Doyle chose to do with this suspicion tells you a great deal about the particular economy of discretion that governed a house of this kind. She said nothing to anyone ever, not to the other servants, not to Charles Hartwell, not, as far as any surviving record indicates, even to Margaret herself. This was not naivety. Mrs. Doyle was, by every account that survives of her, a shrewd and observant woman, entirely capable of drawing the obvious conclusion from a locked closet, an unexplained absence, and a mistress who returned from her afternoon rest smelling faintly of a lamp oil no other room in the house used. Her silence was, instead, a professional calculation, one shared by senior servants across nearly every great house of the period. A housekeeper's position depended entirely on the trust of the family that employed her, and trust, in a household this large, was built almost exclusively on a servant's demonstrated capacity to see everything and repeat nothing. Mrs. Doyle had built her career on precisely this reputation, and she understood, better than almost anyone else in the house, that noticing too much, or noticing correctly and saying so, would end that career far more quickly than any failure of housekeeping ever could. There is a particular kind of intelligence that a great house selected for, almost without meaning to, in the servants it retained longest. It was not primarily the intelligence of competence, though competence mattered. It was the intelligence of knowing precisely how much to see and precisely how little to say, calibrated so finely that a housekeeper could run a household with complete and detailed knowledge of every member's private habits, while maintaining, in every conversation with every member of that household, an expression of complete and untroubled ignorance. You should understand that this was not, for most senior servants, experienced as a moral compromise. It was simply the terms of the profession, understood and accepted from the earliest years of training. A footman who gossiped about what he observed carrying trays through a great house would not last a season in his position. A lady's maid who repeated what she overheard while dressing her mistress would find herself, within days, without a position at all, and without a reference that would secure her another. Discretion was not merely valued in domestic service. It was, in the most literal economic sense, the entire product being sold. This meant that a house of 30 servants was, in practice, a house of 30 people who very likely knew a great deal more about the family's private life than the family themselves realized, and who had every professional incentive to know it silently, to file it away without comment, and to carry on with their duties as though the household contained no secrets at all. It is worth sitting with the strangeness of this arrangement for a moment. The family believed themselves to be private in front of their servants, when in fact the opposite was almost always closer to the truth. It was the servants who were private, systematically and professionally, in front of the family. Margaret Hartwell understood this dynamic better than most women of her class, having grown up in a household considerably less grand than the one she now presided over, where she had observed, as a girl, the particular unspoken agreements between her own mother and the 2 or 3 servants who ran their more modest establishment. She knew, walking to the linen closet on the 3rd floor 2 or 3 times a week, through that first winter, that Mrs. Doyle almost certainly suspected something, and she knew, with equal confidence, that Mrs. Doyle would say nothing, because saying something would accomplish nothing for Mrs. Doyle except the loss of a position she had spent 20 years building. There was, in this arrangement, a kind of grim symmetry that Margaret may or may not have fully appreciated at the time. Her own privacy, purchased through Calloway's careful architecture, depended entirely on a second, older architecture of discretion that had nothing to do with hidden panels or concealed hinges, and everything to do with the economic dependency of servants on the goodwill of the families who employed them. The room in the wall protected her from her husband's notice. The unspoken rules of domestic service protected her from everyone else's. This is worth pausing on, because it complicates any tidy story we might want to tell about a wife quietly outwitting a house built to contain her. The house did contain her, in every meaningful sense, and the small freedom Calloway had built into its walls existed only because an entire invisible workforce chose day after day not to notice what would have been, to any of them individually, perfectly obvious. Margaret's privacy was not simply architectural, it was collectively maintained by people whose names rarely appear in any history of the period, whose discretion has never been credited anywhere, and who received nothing for their silence except the continuation of a wage they could not easily have replaced elsewhere. It is tempting to wonder, reading the fragments of Mrs. Doyle's household diary that survive, filled almost entirely with the plainest possible record of linens counted and meals planned, whether she ever felt the weight of what she was carrying, day after day, in her careful, unremarked-upon silence. The diary offers no answer. It was never written to offer one. It was written, like every other document a senior servant of the period produced, to demonstrate competence and nothing more, and it succeeds at exactly that, revealing nothing of the woman behind it except her evident skill at revealing nothing. The other servants of the household, further down the hierarchy that governed every great house of the period, likely knew considerably less, if anything at all. A junior housemaid, occupied largely with the lower floors, would rarely have reason to approach the third-floor linen closet, and the household's careful division of labour, itself a form of architecture nearly as deliberate as the physical walls, ensured that knowledge of the family's private habits remained concentrated among the small number of senior staff whose positions depended most directly on keeping such knowledge to themselves. This too was a form of design, though no architect had drawn it on any plan. The structure of domestic service in a great house of this period distributed information the same way it distributed physical space, carefully, hierarchically, with the most sensitive knowledge held by the fewest possible people, each of whom had the most to lose by speaking of it. Calloway's hidden room existed within walls he had built. It existed, just as importantly, within a second set of walls no architect had ever drawn, made of loyalty, dependency, and the particular silence that a household of servants learned, from their very first week of employment, to maintain around anything they were never meant to have seen. You should let this settle for a moment before we go further, this quieter understanding of what privacy actually cost in a house like the Hartwells, and who actually paid for it. Margaret Hartwell's room behind the linen closet was never, in truth, entirely her own. It belonged also to Mrs. Doyle, and to the footman who never asked why a particular corridor received more foot traffic than its stated purpose would suggest, and to every other member of a household who noticed, understood, and chose, for reasons of their own survival, never to say a single word. Mrs. Doyle's own life, glimpsed only briefly through the household diary she kept so carefully impersonal, deserves a moment of your attention here, since her discretion was not a passive quality, but an active daily labour of its own. She had entered domestic service at 14, worked her way from scullery maid to housekeeper across 2 decades and 3 households, and had, by the time she came to the Hartwells, developed a private philosophy of her position that she articulated once in a rare personal letter to a younger cousin also entering service, advising the girl that a good servant sees everything and remembers nothing that is not asked of her directly, and that this single habit, practiced without exception, would serve her better than any other skill she might learn. It is a philosophy that reads, at this distance, almost as a kind of quiet heroism, though Mrs. Doyle herself would very likely have rejected the description entirely, understanding her own discretion not as virtue, but as the plainest possible professional necessity. She had seen, over her 20 years in service, housekeepers dismissed for far smaller lapses than the one she was quietly managing on the Hartwells' 3rd floor. A careless remark repeated, a piece of gossip that reached the wrong ears, and she had built her entire career on making certain she would never be that housekeeper, whatever she happened to notice along the way. It is worth understanding, too, the particular financial stakes that gave this discretion its edge. A housekeeper of Mrs. Doyle's seniority earned, by the standards of domestic service, a genuinely comfortable wage, considerably more than she could have hoped to earn in almost any other occupation open to a woman of her background and education. She had, by 1891, saved a modest sum toward the small annuity she hoped would support her eventual retirement, a sum that depended entirely on maintaining her position and her reputation for as many additional years as her health allowed. A single lapse in discretion, however small, could unravel decades of careful saving in a single afternoon. This financial precarity, sitting beneath every senior servant's carefully cultivated silence, deserves more weight in this story than it usually receives. Mrs. Doyle's discretion was not simply a professional habit, it was, in the most literal sense, the mechanism by which she protected her own old age, a fact that connects her situation, in a strange and rarely noticed way, to Margaret's own. Both women, in their different positions, were engaged in a quiet, unglamorous project of securing some small measure of security and autonomy within a system that offered neither easily to a woman of any station. It is worth noting that Mrs. Doyle's silence extended even to her own private diary, the very document that has allowed us to reconstruct so much of this story. She never once wrote, in 20 years of daily entries, anything approaching a direct acknowledgement of the room's existence, recording only the blandest possible domestic details even in passages we now know, from context, must have been written with full awareness of what she was carefully not saying. This is discretion practiced at its most complete, extending even into a private record meant for no eyes but her own, a habit so thoroughly ingrained that it survived even the absence of any audience to protect against. It is worth considering too how this culture of discretion shaped the servants' own relationships with one another, since a household where senior staff routinely kept significant secrets from junior staff, and from each other, necessarily involved a certain quiet distance even among people who worked alongside one another daily, ate meals together in the servants' hall, and in many cases lived under the same roof for years at a stretch. Mrs. Doyle's closest confidant among the household staff, a lady's maid who had served the family nearly as long as she had, appears, from the diary's careful omissions, never to have been told anything at all about the third-floor room, a friendship of considerable warmth that nonetheless contained at its centre this one carefully guarded absence. Let this quiet, watchful household settle around you for a moment. 30 people who saw everything and said nothing, each one carrying some fragment of a silence they had learned to carry as carefully as any duty on their daily list. This meant that her relationship with Margaret, though never once discussed directly in terms either woman would have recognised as an alliance, functioned as exactly that, an unspoken agreement maintained through years of careful mutual restraint, Margaret never explaining, Mrs. Doyle never asking, each woman trusting the other to understand precisely how much could safely remain unsaid between them. It is worth noting, finally, that Mrs. Doyle's own retirement, when it eventually came many years later, was marked by a modest pension considerably more generous than her contract technically required, a quiet gesture from Margaret that neither woman ever discussed directly, but that both understood in the particular unspoken language they had shared for decades, as its own form of gratitude. The household settles back into its ordinary rhythm around this one new absence, 30 people going about their duties exactly as before, one door among many now simply a little more carefully guarded than the rest. Let Mrs. Doyle's careful silence rest a little longer in the stillness of the house she has spent 2 decades learning to read so well. It is worth noting, finally, that the particular vocabulary Mrs. Doyle and her staff developed for discussing what they chose not to discuss deserves its own small mention. Servants of this era developed, across great houses generally, an entire private lexicon of euphemism for exactly this purpose. Phrases like resting in her rooms or attending to correspondence that carried, to those who knew how to read them, a precise and specific meaning entirely distinct from their literal content, a language spoken fluently by everyone below stairs and almost never suspected by anyone above them. The garden behind the wall. By the summer of 1893, word of Calloway's particular skill had travelled, as it always did in that world, quietly and through the most indirect of channels, from one household to another, until it reached a family summering in Newport whose name we will not need in any detail, since their story matters here mainly for what it adds to our understanding of the trade Calloway had by then fully entered. The commission was different in character from the Hartwell room, though it grew from the same essential need. The family's cottage, a shingled house considerably less grand than the marble palaces further along the cliff, backed onto a modest walled garden that had, for years, served no purpose beyond the ordinary one of roses and a gravel path. The wife of the house, whose name survives only as a set of initials in Calloway's private ledger, wanted a small garden folly, a structure that would appear to anyone glancing from the house to be nothing more than an ornamental summer house of the kind fashionable that season, but that would in fact be reachable by a second hidden path, separate from the main garden gate, allowing her to leave the folly and reach the public road beyond the wall without crossing the lawn where her husband and his guests typically took their afternoon cigars. Calloway travelled to Newport that June to survey the property, and spent an afternoon walking the garden's perimeter with a compass and a notebook, working out the angles by which a second gate might be cut into the old stone wall without disturbing the ivy that had grown across it for a generation, thick enough by then to conceal almost anything set behind it. He found what he needed at the garden's furthest corner, where the wall met a stand of overgrown lilac, and proposed a gate no wider than a single person, hinged to swing outward into a narrow lane used mainly by tradesmen's carts, disguised on the garden side by a section of wall built to match the surrounding stone so precisely that a gardener tending the lilac would need to touch it directly to discover it was not in fact solid. The folly itself was built that same summer, a small octagonal structure with a domed roof and a single door facing the main lawn, exactly the sort of ornamental building that appeared, by the dozen, in the gardens of every fashionable Newport cottage that season. What distinguished it, invisible to any visitor admiring its proportions from the lawn, was a second door on its rear wall, facing the lilac and the hidden gate beyond, a door disguised as a decorative panel and reachable only by someone who already knew it was there. You should understand that a structure of this kind served a purpose considerably broader than any single scandal or affair. Calloway's clients, across the dozen or more commissions of this sort that fill his private ledger, wanted these hidden passages for reasons that varied enormously, and it would flatten the truth of the period considerably to imagine every one of them as the setting for a love affair. Some wanted simply the freedom to walk, alone, without a maid or a husband's associate falling into step beside them, an experience so rare in the life of a woman of this class that even an hour of it, uninterrupted, represented a genuine and considerable luxury. Some wanted a place to receive a sister or a childhood friend whose company their husband disapproved of for reasons that had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with old family disputes neither wife wished to relitigate over dinner. Some, it must be said, wanted exactly what the legend of these houses eventually assumed they all wanted, a place to meet someone their husband did not know about and did not need to. The garden folly in Newport, as it happens, was used, according to the fragmentary record that survives, almost entirely for the first and most modest of these purposes. Its owner, in the 2 summers Calloway's ledger records payments related to its maintenance, appears to have used the hidden gate primarily to walk, alone, along the cliff path in the early mornings before the household woke, a habit her husband would very likely not have objected to had she simply asked his permission, but that she preferred, for reasons the record does not explain, to pursue without asking anyone's permission at all. This detail matters because it complicates the version of this story that survives, faintly, in the handful of later accounts written by descendants and historians who stumbled across evidence of these hidden structures and assumed, almost universally, that their purpose could only have been illicit. The truth, as far as it can be reconstructed from the ledgers and letters that remain, was considerably more varied and in its way more interesting. What these women wanted in the great majority of cases was not a lover. It was simply a door that led somewhere their husbands had not already decided for them. This should not surprise us, considered plainly. A woman of Margaret Hartwell's class, or the unnamed wife of the Newport cottage, moved through a world in which nearly every hour of her day was accounted for by someone else's expectations. Her husband's schedule, her children's needs, the demands of a social calendar that treated attendance at certain events as an obligation nearly as binding as any legal contract. The freedom to simply walk somewhere, alone, unaccompanied, unannounced, unaccounted for, was not a small thing in this world. It was, for many of these women, the largest freedom available to them, and it is worth remembering, as we move deeper into stories that will eventually involve rather more than solitary walks, that the desire beneath all of it, the thing every one of Calloway's clients was actually paying for, was never really about who might be waiting at the other end of the passage. It was about the passage itself, and the simple, radical fact of choosing for an hour where to be. Calloway understood this better than most of his contemporaries would have, had they known his trade, because he had watched it play out, commission after commission, across nearly a decade by the time the Newport Folly was finished. He kept, in his private ledger, a shorthand notation for each client's stated purpose, and reading back through those entries years later, a historian sympathetic to his subject might notice how rarely the notation suggests romance at all, and how often it suggests, instead, something closer to a simple, exhausted longing for an hour that belonged to no one but the person living it. The lilac at the garden's edge grew thicker each year, and the hidden gate swung open perhaps twice a week through those first 2 summers, left almost no mark on the stone around it, no wear pattern a gardener would think to question, no gap in the ivy that a passing glance would register as unusual. It closed as quietly as it opened, the octagonal folly resuming, the moment its rear door was latched, its entirely ordinary appearance as an ornamental garden building, admired by guests taking their afternoon tea on the lawn a few dozen feet away, none of whom ever thought to wonder what lay on its far side. It is this quality, above nearly everything else, that Calloway's work depended on and cultivated with such care. The ordinary appearance of the extraordinary, the perfect, uneventful blending of a secret into a landscape so thoroughly that no one, not even a trained eye looking for something amiss, would find any reason to look twice. A garden folly is only ever a garden folly, until the moment someone who already knows better presses against exactly the right panel, at exactly the right hour, and the wall gives way to something the rest of the world was never meant to see. The commission also illustrates something about how Calloway's reputation actually spread, since the chain of recommendation that led from the Newport household to his door tells us a good deal about the particular social network these women maintained, invisible to their husbands in almost exactly the way the rooms themselves were. A housekeeper in one household, trusted by her mistress with a small fragment of the truth, might mention Calloway's name, obliquely, to a lady's maid in another household during a chance conversation at a market stall or a church social, and that lady's maid might months later repeat the name to her own mistress at exactly the right unguarded moment, when a particular longing had grown pressing enough to be spoken aloud at last. This network had no name, kept no records, and left almost no trace beyond the pattern of Calloway's own commissions, clustered as they were among households connected by exactly this kind of second-hand, servant-mediated trust. It is worth imagining it as a kind of shadow society, running parallel to the more visible social world of calling cards and reception lines, its members largely unknown to one another, its only common thread the shared understanding that certain kinds of need could not be spoken of directly, and required instead this slow, careful, indirect transmission from one trusted ear to the next. The Newport summer season, in particular, provided fertile ground for this kind of quiet transmission, since the same families who occupied separate townhouses in Manhattan for most of the year found themselves clustered, for 8 or 10 weeks each summer, along a few miles of cliffside, their household staffs mingling at church, at market, at the modest boarding houses where junior servants took their half-days off. A piece of information that might take a full winter season to travel between 2 Manhattan households could cross the same social distance in Newport within a matter of weeks, carried on the accelerated gossip of a compressed summer season where everyone's staff knew, roughly, everyone else's business. This is perhaps part of why Newport itself, of all the fashionable resorts wealthy Americans might have chosen, produced such a disproportionate share of the commissions in Calloway's ledger. It was not only the particular architecture of the cottages themselves, generous gardens, walled properties, structures built with more room for creative concealment than a narrow Manhattan townhouse allowed. It was also, simply, that Newport concentrated exactly the kind of dense, trust-based servant network that made word of a discreet architect's existence travel fastest and furthest. It is worth noting, too, that the Folly's owner never learned Calloway's name directly, having arranged the entire commission through an intermediary, a mutual acquaintance who passed messages between architect and client without either ever needing to correspond directly until the first in-person meeting. This additional layer of indirection, more elaborate than the arrangement Margaret Hartwell had used, reflects the particular caution of a woman whose husband, unlike Charles Hartwell, took a closer interest in his wife's correspondence, requiring an even more careful architecture of concealment around the commission itself before a single stone of the garden wall had even been touched. The Garden Folly's owner, in the one surviving letter she wrote many years later to a niece, reflecting in general terms on her younger years without ever naming the specific arrangement, described the particular pleasure of the cliff walk itself, the sound of the ocean below, the specific quality of a Newport morning before the rest of the household had woken, in language considerably more vivid and detailed than anything else in her surviving correspondence, suggesting that these solitary walks, however modest they might sound described plainly, represented some of the most vividly remembered hours of her entire life. Let the sound of the ocean below the cliff path stay with you a little longer, steady and unbothered, indifferent to whichever secrets happened to walk along its edge that particular morning. Let this settle into the rhythm of the evening now, the particular quiet of a garden at dusk in high summer, lilac heavy on the air, the lawn beyond it empty of guests, the last light fading behind a wall built a generation before anyone thought to hide a second gate inside it. Somewhere in that stillness a woman is walking a cliff path alone, unaccounted for, unremarked upon, entirely and briefly her own, and the house behind her, however grand, however carefully watched, has no way of knowing where she has gone. It is worth noting, too, that the lilac hedge concealing the Folly's second gate was replanted twice over the following decades by gardeners who had no idea of its true purpose, each one instructed only to keep the corner especially dense, a request passed down through generations of household staff as simply an established preference of the family, its original reasoning long since forgotten by everyone except the family itself. The lilac will bloom again next spring as it always does, indifferent to the small gate hidden at its roots, and the Folly will stand through another Newport summer looking exactly as ornamental and exactly as innocent as it always has. Let the Newport evening deepen now, cliffs and ocean and lilac all settling together into the same unhurried dusk. It is worth noting, too, that the Newport Commission concluded with an unusual gesture on the client's part. She sent Calloway, some months after the Folly's completion, a small potted lilac cutting taken from the very hedge that concealed his handiwork, a gift he kept on the windowsill of his own lodgings for the rest of his life, one of the only physical mementos from any of his 17 commissions that he permitted himself to keep. The rival trade. Calloway was not, it should be said plainly, the only architect of his era practising this particular quiet specialty, and it would flatten the truth of the period considerably to imagine him as some singular figure operating entirely alone. What made him unusual was not the existence of his trade, but the unusual completeness of the record that happens through a handful of fortunate accidents to survive it. Other architects, working the same 8 or 10 blocks of Manhattan and the same stretch of Newport cliffside, almost certainly built rooms of a similar kind for similar reasons, leaving behind their own scattered fragments of evidence that historians have, for the most part, either never found or never recognized for what they were. A handful of these parallel practitioners can be glimpsed faintly in the margins of other architectural records from the period. A firm in Boston, whose otherwise unremarkable ledgers include several entries for what are described only as special interior modifications, build at rates considerably higher than the ordinary carpentry work surrounding them. A single architect in Philadelphia, whose personal correspondence, preserved by chance in a university archive, includes one startlingly candid letter to a former apprentice describing the particular satisfaction of solving what he calls, in a phrase that has puzzled the handful of researchers who have encountered it, problems of domestic invisibility. None of these fragments amount to anything like the reconstructed narrative we have been able to build around Calloway and the Hartwell house, but taken together, they suggest a trade considerably wider than any single practitioner, a loose, entirely informal guild with no shared name, no meetings, no acknowledgement of one another's existence, connected only by the same underlying demand running through the same rarefied stratum of American society during the same 40-year window of unprecedented private wealth. It is worth understanding why this window closed as decisively as it did. since the trade Calloway practiced did not simply fade gradually into obsolescence, but ended in the span of little more than a generation, for reasons that had almost nothing to do with any particular architect's retirement or death. The economic and social conditions that had made such rooms both desirable and possible were themselves distinctly of their moment, and when that moment passed, the entire trade passed with it. Consider first the sheer scale of household staff required to make a hidden room meaningful in the first place. A room's concealment mattered only in proportion to how thoroughly a household otherwise watched its occupants, and the enormous domestic staffs of the Gilded Age, 30 and 40 servants in a single house, created precisely the kind of comprehensive, constant observation that made genuine privacy so scarce, and therefore so valuable, that women were willing to pay considerable sums to purchase a fragment of it. By the 1920s, this scale of household staff had become, for reasons both economic and social, increasingly rare even among wealthy families, and a household with 5 or 6 servants rather than 30 simply did not generate the same suffocating density of observation that had made Calloway's particular service worth commissioning at all. Consider, second, the introduction of a federal income tax in 1913, a change that seems, on its surface, to have nothing whatsoever to do with hidden rooms, but that in fact reshaped the entire economic foundation on which the great houses of the previous 4 decades had been built. Fortunes that had once passed largely untaxed from one generation to the next began, gradually but unmistakably, to shrink under the new burden, and the great houses themselves, extraordinarily expensive to build, staff, and maintain even by the standards of extreme wealth, became, one by one, financial liabilities that heirs increasingly chose to sell rather than sustain. Consider, third, the changing social position of women themselves across the same decades, a shift that, while agonizingly slow and incomplete by any modern measure, nonetheless altered the specific texture of the confinement that had made rooms like Margaret Hartwell's so precious to her. The generation of women who came of age in the 1910s and 1920s, watching the long, hard-fought campaign for suffrage finally succeed in 1920, inherited a world that offered them, however imperfectly, considerably more legitimate avenue for the kind of autonomy their mothers had been forced to purchase secretly, through architecture, one carefully hidden room at a time. None of this happened suddenly. The trade did not end on any single date, and Calloway's own successor, Peter Voss, continued to receive occasional commissions of this kind well into the 1920s, though his ledger, which survives in considerably better condition than his mentor's, records a steadily declining frequency across that decade, from 4 or 5 commissions in a good year during the 1910s to barely 1 every other year by the late 1920s, the demand simply dissolving gradually into a world that had less need of the particular service it represented. By the time the Depression arrived at the decade's close, the trade had effectively ended altogether, not through any decisive event but through the slow, unglamorous erosion of the entire social world it had depended upon, the great houses sold or demolished, the domestic staffs reduced to a fraction of their former scale, the women who might once have commissioned such a room finding, increasingly, other and more direct avenues toward the autonomy their mothers had needed a hidden door to purchase. It is worth pausing, before we return to the closing chapters of Margaret Hartwell's own story, to consider what this entire vanished trade represents when viewed from a sufficient distance. Not a scandal in the end, nor even primarily a story of romance, though romance certainly occurred within it. It represents instead a strange and largely unrecorded footnote to a much larger history, the history of how privacy itself, that most ordinary and unremarkable of human needs, had to be purchased secretly and at considerable expense by an entire generation of women whose formal legal and social standing offered them, in almost every other respect, so little of it at all. It is worth noting, finally, that this trade's near-total disappearance from the historical record is not in itself unusual. Most quiet trades disappear this way, leaving behind only the visible monuments of the more celebrated professions built alongside them, the marble staircases and painted ceilings that photograph well and therefore survive in memory, while the narrower, more private work that made those grand houses genuinely livable, for the women inside them, vanishes almost entirely, remembered, if at all, only by the rare historian patient enough to notice a strange entry in an old ledger or a peculiar phrase in a housekeeper's otherwise unremarkable diary. This is, in its way, simply how most history actually survives, not as a complete and faithful record of everything that mattered, but as a thin and accidental scattering of fragments, weighted heavily toward whatever happened to be photographed, published, or preserved by an institution with the resources to keep it. The quieter histories, the ones lived mostly in silence, by people with every reason to keep them silent, survive only when chance intervenes, a diary that happens not to be discarded, a letter that happens to travel the right direction before a demolition crew arrives. It is worth sitting for a moment with how much of this wider trade we will simply never recover, no matter how carefully future historians search. 14 of Calloway's 17 commissions left behind, as far as any current record shows, no trace at all beyond the bare initials in his own private ledger, no diary, no letters, no fortunate foreman's passing curiosity. Those 14 households, and the women who commissioned rooms within them, exist now only as a pair of initials and a sum of money, their particular stories, whatever they were, lost as completely as if they had never happened at all. It is worth imagining gently the particular texture each of those 14 lost stories might once have had. A widow in one house, perhaps, a young bride in another, a woman somewhere further up the Hudson Valley, whose particular reason for wanting a hidden door we will simply never know. They are not absent from history because their needs mattered less than Margaret Hartwell's. They are absent only because the accident of preservation happened to favour her house, and not theirs. A reminder that the story we have followed tonight is one thread among many, chosen not because it was the most significant, but because it was, by pure chance, the one that survived to be told at all. Let this wider, largely unrecorded trade rest now too, 17 known rooms standing in for however many hundreds we will never know existed at all. You're walking, tonight, through the very last surviving fragment of that vanished trade, reconstructed as faithfully as scattered ledgers and diaries and letters allow, and it is worth letting the scale of it settle, gently before we return, in the chapters ahead, to the particular closing details of the one house we have followed most closely. Let the weight of this wider history rest lightly, the way any large thing must rest lightly if it is to accompany you into sleep, present but no longer pressing, understood but no longer requiring anything further of your waking attention. It is worth noting too that a single additional commission surfaced only recently in 2019, when a Boston Historical Society digitizing an unrelated collection of household accounts found a marginal notation matching Calloway's private shorthand, suggesting that even now, more than a century later, fragments of this vanished trade continue occasionally to surface, waiting patiently in archives no one has yet thought to search with this particular story in mind. The wider trade rests now, folded back into the handful of surviving fragments that first allowed us to glimpse it at all, waiting patiently for whichever future researcher happens to notice the next small clue. Let this wider history rest now alongside the one house we have followed most closely, two scales of the same quiet, patient story. It is worth noting too that no professional association, no historical society, no museum collection has ever formally catalogued this particular trade as its own category of study, meaning that everything reconstructed here required piecing together evidence never designed to be read collectively, a small act of assembly performed for the first time, as far as any record shows, specifically for this evening's telling. Letters that never travelled by post. By the second winter, the small room behind the linen closet had become, for Margaret Hartwell, less a place she visited occasionally, and more a fixed point in the architecture of her week, an hour on Tuesday afternoons and another on Friday mornings set aside in her own private accounting, the way other hours were set aside for calls and fittings and the children's lessons. She read there, mostly, working through a shelf of novels and increasingly volumes of history and political economy that she would not have felt comfortable being seen reading in the house's more public rooms, where a husband's occasional visiting associate might raise an eyebrow at a woman's interest in subjects considered in that world unnecessary for her to understand. It was through this reading that she began, in the winter of 1892, a correspondence that would occupy an increasing share of her hours in the hidden room over the following 2 years. The correspondent was a woman named Eleanor Ashford, a widow of modest means who had, before her husband's death, published a handful of essays on political economy under her own name, a rare enough occurrence that Margaret had noticed the byline and, in a moment of impulse she later described in her own letters as entirely unlike her usual caution, written to the author care of the journal that had published her, asking a question about a point the essay had raised. Eleanor Ashford's reply arrived within the month, thoughtful and considerably longer than the brief question that had prompted it, and Margaret found herself, reading it in the quiet of the hidden room, experiencing something she had not experienced in a very long time, the sensation of being addressed by another person, as though her mind were the primary point of interest, rather than her position, her wardrobe, or her husband's fortune. She wrote back the same week, and a correspondence began that would continue letter by letter for the better part of 2 years, growing gradually from questions of political economy into something considerably wider, opinions on books each had read, small observations about the strangeness of the world each occupied, the particular loneliness of a woman's education in a household that had never encouraged her to finish it. You should understand that this correspondence, whatever else it eventually became, began and largely remained a friendship of the mind, conducted almost entirely on paper, between two women who met in person perhaps 4 times across its entire duration. It was not, in the narrower sense, the scandal that legend eventually attached to houses like the Hartwells, and it would misrepresent the record considerably to suggest otherwise. What it was, instead, was something the period had very little vocabulary for and even less tolerance of. 2 women, each isolated in her own particular way, finding in each other's letters a kind of intellectual companionship that neither had access to anywhere else in her daily life. The letters could not, of course, be received at the Hartwell house itself, where every piece of correspondence passed through the hands of at least one servant before reaching its intended recipient, and where a housekeeper as attentive as Mrs. Doyle would very likely have noticed sooner or later the regular arrival of an unfamiliar hand. Margaret arranged instead, through a discreet conversation with the same milliner whose parlour had hosted her first meeting with Calloway, to have Eleanor Ashford's letters delivered to the shop, collected during what appeared to anyone watching to be an entirely ordinary errand undertaken once or twice a week. This arrangement, small and practical as it was, depended entirely on the existence of the hidden room, since a letter collected from a milliner's shop still needed somewhere to be read, and reread, and eventually answered, without any possibility of a servant glimpsing an unfamiliar hand on the desk in Margaret's ordinary sitting room. The room behind the linen closet became, in this way, not merely a place of solitude, but a kind of post office of the mind, the single address in the entire house where Margaret Hartwell could be, for an hour at a time, not a wife or a mother or a hostess, but simply a woman corresponding with another woman about ideas that mattered to her. Eleanor Ashford, for her part, understood the strangeness of her friend's circumstances better than almost anyone else could have, having herself lived, for the 11 years of her marriage, under a set of constraints not entirely unlike the ones Margaret described in increasingly candid letters. Widowed young and left with a modest independent income, Eleanor had discovered, in the years since her husband's death, a freedom that had shocked her at first with its sheer scale, the simple, previously unthinkable liberty of deciding on any given morning precisely how she wished to spend the day, answerable to no one. It was this freedom, described in Eleanor's letters with a plainness Margaret found almost unbearably moving, that Margaret herself began to want tentatively in the margins of letters she was careful never to send in their most unguarded drafts. She wrote entire pages describing a longing for a life she did not, in any practical sense, believe she could ever have. 3 children and a household of 30, and a marriage that was, whatever its emotional distances, entirely secure and entirely respectable, and burned most of these pages in the hidden room's small grate, before writing a considerably more measured letter to send in their place. You should not imagine, reading this, that Margaret Hartwell was contemplating anything so dramatic as leaving her marriage, or that her correspondence with Eleanor Ashford represented some grand rebellion against the life she'd been given. The truth, as the surviving fragments suggest, was quieter, and in its way sadder than that. Margaret wanted the room, and the correspondence, and the hour on Tuesday afternoons, precisely because they let her hold, at a safe distance, a version of freedom she had no genuine intention of pursuing any further. The letters were not a plan. They were a kind of private, uncomplaining grief, given a place to exist that the rest of her life had never offered it. This is perhaps the truest use to which Calloway's hidden rooms were ever put, across the dozen commissions that fill his private ledger, more common by far than any love affair the later legends would insist upon. They were rooms for grief that had nowhere else to go, for the private mourning of a life not lived alongside the actual dutiful maintenance of the life that was. A husband occupied entirely with shipping contracts, a household that ran each day with the same seamless competence whether or not its mistress was present in any of its visible rooms, and somewhere behind a linen closet, an hour set aside twice a week for a woman to feel, briefly and without consequence, the shape of a self she had otherwise set aside the day she married. The correspondence continued through the winter and into the following 2 years, slowing gradually as Eleanor Ashford's own health began, by 1894, to decline, the effects of a heart condition that had troubled her since childhood, and that would, within another 2 years, end her life at the age of 41, in the small house outside Boston, where she had lived alone since her husband's death. Margaret learned of Eleanor's death from a brief notice in a newspaper she happened to see while sitting in the hidden room one Tuesday afternoon, and sat with the paper on her lap for the better part of an hour, according to the single, oblique reference to the day that survives in a letter she wrote years later to one of her own daughters, describing only a loss she declined to name in any greater detail. The final letters between the two women, preserved among a small collection of Eleanor Ashford's papers, donated to a historical society decades after both women's deaths, end not with any dramatic farewell, but with the same measured, careful warmth that had characterized the correspondence from its earliest exchange. Two women discussing in their final letters to one another a book they had both recently read, and the particular loneliness Eleanor wrote in what would be nearly her last letter, of finishing a good book with no one nearby to discuss it with properly. Margaret travelled to Boston for Eleanor's funeral that autumn, a journey she managed by telling her household she was visiting a cousin, a small and by then well-practiced deception that troubled her, according to the same later letter to her daughter, rather more than any of the deceptions the hidden room itself had required of her over the years. She stood at the back of a modest gathering of perhaps 20 mourners, most of them Eleanor's late husband's relations rather than friends of Eleanor's own choosing, and introduced herself to no one, watching a service conducted for a woman whose truest correspondence, whose most honestly examined thoughts of the past 4 years had been addressed to a stranger these 20 mourners had never heard of and would never think to ask about. She returned to New York the following day and did not visit the hidden room again for nearly 3 weeks, an absence Mrs. Doyle's diary notes only obliquely, remarking that the mistress had seemed unusually tired that autumn, a phrase that, read alongside everything else we now know, carries a weight. The housekeeper who wrote it could not have intended, but that any reader familiar with the full story will recognise instantly as something considerably closer to grief. When Margaret finally did return to the room, in the last week of November, she brought with her a small, unremarkable photograph, the only surviving image of Eleanor Ashford, taken some years earlier by a Boston studio and enclosed, at some point in their correspondence, with one of Eleanor's letters. She had it framed, modestly, in a plain wooden frame that matched nothing else in the room's furnishings, and set it on the small writing desk where it remained, according to the one later description of the room's contents that survives, for the rest of the room's active use. It is a small, quiet detail, easy to overlook amid the larger sweep of the story, but it tells us something worth carrying forward, that whatever this correspondence had been, friendship, intellectual companionship, a love that never fully named itself even in its most private letters, it had mattered enough to Margaret that she wanted its one surviving physical trace close at hand, in the single room in her entire house where she was free to keep it visible, without explanation, for as long as she lived. It is worth noting, finally, how carefully Margaret managed the physical evidence of this correspondence at every stage, burning drafts, storing final letters in a locked drawer, never once risking a single page in any room of the house beyond the one built specifically to hold it. This care extended even to her own handwriting, which she adjusted slightly for these letters, a small deliberate stiffening of certain letter forms that a handwriting expert consulted decades later, out of pure historical curiosity, noted as distinct from her signature on ordinary household correspondence, as though even her hand understood that these particular words required a different kind of care than anything else she ever wrote. It is worth noting, too, the particular vulnerability inherent in Margaret's choice to keep every one of Eleanor's letters rather than destroying them after reading. A choice her own careful habit of burning her own unsent drafts suggests she understood the risk of clearly, that she kept them anyway, for the whole of her adult life, in a locked drawer in the one room built specifically to protect them, tells us something about how much they mattered to her, weighed against a caution she otherwise exercised in nearly every other aspect of the arrangement. Let the shape of that friendship rest with you now, two women who never fully met in any ordinary sense, and yet who came, across 4 years of careful letters, to know each other more completely than either was known by anyone standing in the same room with them each day. Margaret kept every letter Eleanor Ashford ever sent her, in a locked drawer of the small writing desk in the hidden room, for the rest of her own long life, and it is from this collection, preserved by a granddaughter who found them decades later and, recognising their evident value, donated them along with Eleanor's own surviving papers, that most of what we know of this particular correspondence survives at all. It is a small, quiet archive, unremarkable by the standards of grand historical drama, and it tells us more clearly than almost anything else in this story what these hidden rooms were most often actually for. Not scandal, in the end, but the simple, aching need of a person to be known briefly and honestly by someone who was not required, by marriage or duty, to know them at all. It is worth adding, finally, that Margaret's granddaughter, discovering the letters decades later, initially assumed them to be nothing more than an old friendship, and it was only years afterward, reading them again as an adult with a fuller understanding of the period, that she began to suspect the correspondence had meant something considerably deeper to her grandmother than the word friendship alone could capture. The letters rest now in their locked drawer, waiting for whichever quiet Tuesday afternoon will next bring someone back to read them. Let the correspondence rest now in its locked drawer, two women's careful words waiting quietly for whichever autumn afternoon will next call them back into the light. It is worth noting, too, that Eleanor Ashford's own modest house outside Boston contained, according to the one surviving description left by a neighbour interviewed decades later for an unrelated local history project, an entire wall of shelves devoted to correspondence, carefully organised and clearly treasured, suggesting a woman for whom letters themselves, quite apart from any single correspondent, had become one of life's central and sustaining pleasures. If you're drifting now, let yourself go, subscribe so the next story's waiting when you return. Sleep well. The ballroom's other half. The Hartwells held their largest reception of the 1893 season on a Thursday evening in January, an event that the following morning's society pages would describe, in the breathless language reserved for such occasions, as among the finest entertainments New York had seen that winter. 400 guests moving through rooms banked with hothouse flowers grown specially for the occasion, an orchestra imported from a hotel uptown, supper served at midnight from a table long enough to require its own small staff simply to keep it replenished. You have already walked the visible half of an evening like this one, the marble stairs crowded with arriving guests, the ballroom's painted ceiling glowing under new electric light that half the guests had never seen installed in a private house before, and spent a good portion of the evening remarking upon. What you have not yet walked is the other half, the half that made the first half possible, running invisibly behind every wall the guests admired, as busy that night as it had ever been. Consider the kitchen, 3 floors below the ballroom and connected to it by a service stair and 2 dumbwaiters, working in continuous rotation from 7 in the evening until well past midnight. A staff of cooks, doubled for the occasion with additional help hired from an agency that specialised in supplying great houses for exactly this kind of entertainment, moved through a heat that the guests upstairs, cooled by open windows and the particular chill of a January night, would never once feel or think to imagine. Every dish that arrived at the supper table, arranged with such apparent effortlessness, represented an hour or more of labour conducted entirely out of sight, in a room whose existence the ballroom's architecture was specifically designed to erase from a guest's awareness. Consider the cloakroom, where 2 housemaids spent the evening receiving and cataloguing 400 coats and wraps, memorizing, without any written system beyond their own careful attention, which garment belonged to which guest, so that the departure at the evening's end, when it came, would proceed without a single moment's confusion or delay. the enormous logistical achievement of this task rendered entirely invisible by its own success. Consider the servants' stair itself, running parallel to the grand staircase the guests ascended, carrying footmen up with trays of champagne and down with empty glasses, a constant, careful traffic conducted in a passage narrow enough that two men carrying trays in opposite directions had developed, over years of practice, a particular sideways shuffle that let them pass without a single glass so much as trembling. And consider on the third floor, considerably quieter than the rooms below, the small room behind the linen closet, where Margaret Hartwell had slipped away for perhaps 20 minutes at 10:30 that evening, between greeting her arriving guests and the supper she was required to preside over at midnight, not for any assignation or correspondence, but simply to sit, alone, in the green armchair, in a silence made all the more complete by its contrast with the orchestra's music reaching her faintly through 2 floors of wall, and to breathe, for those 20 minutes, without the particular effort that 400 guests required of a hostess who had been performing gracious attention since 7 that evening and would need to sustain it for several hours more. This, too, was among the room's most common uses, one that Calloway had not specifically anticipated when he first drew the plans, but that made a certain obvious sense once Margaret described it to him, years later, in one of the rare subsequent conversations the two maintained across the following decade. The room was not only a place for correspondence or solitary reading, it was, on the busiest and most demanding evenings of the social calendar, a place to simply stop, for a quarter of an hour, the exhausting performance that a woman in Margaret's position was expected to sustain nearly without interruption from the moment she woke until the moment her last guest departed. You might wonder how she managed the practical mechanics of such a disappearance, 20 minutes unaccounted for during her own reception, without a guest or a servant noticing her absence and asking, with the particular polite curiosity of high society, wherever their hostess had got to. The answer, worked out over the 2 years since the room's construction, involved a small deception nearly as carefully engineered as the passage itself. Margaret had trained herself to announce, to whichever guest she was speaking with as she felt the need for the room approach, that she needed a moment to check on the supper arrangements, a claim so plausible and so tediously domestic that no one ever thought to follow her, or to remark on it afterward, or to notice that the 20 minutes she was gone considerably exceeded what checking on a supper table might reasonably require. It is worth noting, considering this particular use of the room, how much of a hostess's labour in this period was invisible in precisely the same way the servant's labour was invisible, though for entirely different reasons and to entirely different effect. A servant's labour was hidden so that the family's comfort could appear spontaneous. A hostess's labour, the ceaseless attentiveness, the remembering of names and connections and old grievances between guests who must on no account be seated together, the physical stamina required to stand and smile and converse for 6 or 8 hours without visible fatigue, was hidden simply because it was expected to be, because the entire performance depended on making an enormous effort appear effortless. The 2 forms of invisible labour, the servants and the hostesses, ran through the house that January evening on parallel but entirely separate tracks, each dependent on its own architecture, physical in the case of the servants, purely social and psychological in the case of Margaret's own performance, and it was the small room behind the linen closet that offered her the one resource neither track ordinarily provided, a place to set the performance down, briefly, before picking it back up again for the remainder of the evening. She returned to the ballroom at 10 minutes to 11, having splashed a little water on her face from the small basin Calloway had fitted into the room during a minor addition the previous spring, and resumed her place near the ballroom's entrance exactly as though she had never left it, greeting a late-arriving couple with the same warm, unhurried attention she had shown every earlier guest, betraying nothing of the 20 minutes of silence that had, in some way she could not have fully articulated even to herself, made the remaining hours of the evening considerably more bearable. The reception continued past midnight, the orchestra playing until nearly 2, the last guests departing in a slow procession of carriages that Charles Hartwell, standing at the top of the entrance steps in the cold January air, saw off with the particular satisfied exhaustion of a man who had, by every visible measure, hosted an unqualified success. He would remark to Margaret as they climbed the grand staircase together sometime after 2 in the morning, that the evening had gone remarkably well, that she had been, as always, a superb hostess, and Margaret would agree entirely truthfully that yes, it had gone well, without mentioning, because there was no reason to, and because he would never think to ask, the 20 minutes on the third floor that had, in her own private accounting, made the difference between an evening she endured and an evening she survived. Consider, too, the considerable physical toll such an evening exacted, one that the surviving accounts of Gilded Age hostessing rarely dwell on, but that any honest reconstruction ought to acknowledge. Margaret had been dressed since 4 that afternoon, in a gown whose boning made sitting for any length of time genuinely uncomfortable, had stood or moved for the better part of 10 hours by the time the last carriage departed, and had maintained, across those 10 hours, an expression of warm and undivided attention for several hundred separate conversations, each one requiring her to remember names, family connections, old slights to avoid reviving, and old alliances to gently reinforce. It is worth understanding hostessing at this level not as a passive social role, but as a genuine and exhausting form of skilled labour, one that simply happened to be unpaid, unacknowledged as labour at all, and expected as a matter of course from any woman in Margaret's position. The 20 minutes in the hidden room did not erase this labour or its cost. It simply made the cost for one evening slightly more bearable, the way a single deep breath does not undo a long day's exhaustion, but makes the next hour of it possible to face. It is worth comparing this particular use of the room to what we might now recognise, with the vocabulary of a later century, as a simple and ordinary act of self-preservation, the kind that has no dramatic name attached to it, that requires no scandal or secrecy to justify, and that most people, in most eras, have been permitted to seek out without needing an architect's discretion at all. A tired man of the period could excuse himself to his club for an hour, could step into his own study and close the door, could simply announce that he required a moment's peace, and no one in his household would think to question the request or its duration. Margaret Hartwell required a hidden room, a false panel, and a rehearsed excuse about the supper arrangements to claim the same 20 minutes. This asymmetry, considered plainly, is perhaps the clearest single measure of everything this story has been quietly circling around from its opening chapter. Not cruelty, not villainy, but a simple and pervasive difference in what a household's architecture assumed a person might need, and whether that need required justification, disguise, and an elaborate secret mechanism, or whether it could simply be announced plainly and granted without question. It is worth imagining, too, how Margaret prepared herself in the moments just before returning to the ballroom that January evening, smoothing her skirts, checking her reflection in the small mirror Calloway had fitted above the room's basin, composing her features back into the warm, attentive expression a hostess was required to wear. This small ritual of recomposure, performed in complete privacy, represents its own quiet skill, the ability to set down an exhausted self and pick back up a performed one seamlessly in the space of a few practiced minutes. It is worth imagining, too, the particular skill required simply to leave a crowded ballroom unnoticed, a skill Margaret refined over years of practice into something approaching genuine art. She learned to time her departure to moments when several separate conversations were converging near the ballroom's entrance, using the resulting small confusion of greetings and introductions as cover, slipping through a side door that led, by a route entirely unremarkable to anyone watching, toward the service stair and eventually the third floor. Let the ballroom's music fade a little further now, the particular relief of 20 minutes silence still settling somewhere behind your ribs, exactly the way it once settled behind Margaret's. This is, perhaps, the quietest and least dramatic use to which any of Calloway's rooms was ever put, and yet reading through the fragments of evidence that survive, across every commission recorded in his private ledger, it may also have been the most common one. Not an affair, not even, in most cases, correspondence of any particular weight. Simply a door that led to 20 minutes of silence, on the evenings when 20 minutes of silence was the single, scarcest resource in a house otherwise abundant in everything money could buy. It is worth noting, too, that Charles Hartwell hosted, across his 30 years of marriage, several hundred similar receptions, each one requiring the same performance from his wife, and that he appears, from every surviving account, never once to have wondered how she managed to sustain such consistent, apparently effortless warmth across so many exhausting evenings. The orchestra plays on below, and the house continues its evening exactly as 400 guests believe it to be continuing, unaware of the 20 minutes that just passed 2 floors above their heads. Let the last carriage of the evening pull away now, its wheels fading slowly into the cold January quiet. It is worth noting, too, that January receptions of this scale required weeks of preparation that began long before the first guest arrived, menus finalised with the cook a full month in advance, flowers ordered from hothouses that grew nothing else for the entire preceding season, invitations engraved and delivered by hand to ensure no crucial name was accidentally excluded from a list whose composition itself functioned as a small, precise map of the household's exact social standing that particular winter. It is worth one final note on this particular evening, that the January reception was, by every social measure available to the period, judged an unqualified triumph, discussed approvingly in drawing rooms for weeks afterward, its success measured entirely in the visible splendour of flowers and orchestras and supper tables, with not a single guest, then or since, ever aware of the 20 minutes that had quietly made the whole performance possible. The ledger of small private rooms. By the time Calloway reached his mid-40s, in the last years of the century, his private ledger recorded 17 commissions of the particular kind we have been following through the Hartwell house, scattered across townhouses in Manhattan, summer cottages in Newport, and a handful of country estates further up the Hudson Valley, each one entered under a client's initials rather than their full name, each one described in a shorthand of his own devising that no one outside his own hand would ever have been able to translate with confidence. You should picture this ledger the way you might picture any careful tradesman's record book, columns for dates and sums received, except that where another man's ledger might note a client's address in plain script, Calloway's noted only a pair of letters and a number, and where another man's ledger might describe the work performed, a staircase repaired, a roof reshingled, Calloway's described nothing at all beyond a sum and a season, the actual nature of each commission held only in his own memory, and increasingly as the years passed, in the small folio of hand-drawn plans, he kept locked in a drawer of his own writing desk, never once shown to another living person. Reading back through the fragments of this ledger that survive 17 commissions across roughly 15 years, it becomes possible to see the shape of a trade that never had a name and never advertised itself, that grew entirely through the whispered recommendations of one discreet housekeeper to another, one careful wife to a friend she trusted, over a decade and a half in which the great houses of the Gilded Age were rising, one after another, along Fifth Avenue and the Newport Cliffs, each one photographed extensively for the newspapers, each one, in a small but consistent minority of cases, containing somewhere within its walls a room that no photograph would ever capture, and no architectural history would ever record. It is worth pausing here to consider how this trade fit into the larger, more visible profession Calloway also practiced, the ordinary work of townhouses and modest commercial buildings that made up the bulk of his career, and that, in the strictest sense, paid his rent and supported the household he eventually established when he married, considerably later in life than most of his contemporaries, a woman named Susan Whitcomb, the daughter of a printer, whom he met, according to the one surviving account of their courtship, at a lecture on structural ironwork that neither of them, by their own later joking admission, had particularly wanted to attend. Susan Calloway, as she became in 1897, never learned the full extent of her husband's private commissions, though she almost certainly understood in general terms that some portion of his income came from work he preferred not to discuss at the dinner table, a discretion that mirrored, in its own way, the discretion he provided his clients. Theirs appears, from the small number of personal letters that survive between them, to have been a companionable and affectionate marriage, built on a mutual respect for each other's privacy, that Calloway, of all men in his profession, understood perhaps better than anyone else alive. The 17 commissions themselves, considered together rather than one at a time, reveal a pattern that complicates any simple story we might want to tell about scandalous architects and unfaithful wives. Of the 17, Calloway's own notations suggest that roughly half involved no romantic element whatsoever, rooms and passages built for the reasons that had motivated the Newport Garden folly, solitude, the freedom of unaccompanied movement, a place to receive a disapproved of friend or relation, a place to grieve, to think, to simply exist for an hour without an audience. A smaller number, perhaps 5 or 6 of the 17, appear to have involved what the period would have called an affair, arrangements Calloway's shorthand notes with a particular symbol he used for no other purpose, though even here, reading the surrounding entries with care, the picture that emerges is considerably less lurid than legend would eventually make of it. These were not, for the most part, brief or frivolous arrangements. Several appear to have continued for years, conducted with the same careful, unhurried discretion that characterized every other aspect of these women's lives. Love affairs that more closely resembled long, quiet friendships than anything a novelist of the period would have recognized as romance. The remaining handful of commissions defy easy categorization altogether, rooms built for purposes Calloway's shorthand records only obliquely. A widow who wanted a place to keep her late husband's letters, where his family, contesting the estate, could never find them. A mother who wanted a passage connecting her rooms directly to her eldest daughters, so she could reach the girl quickly during a period of illness. The family preferred not to discuss with the wider household, an aunt, unmarried, and living within a married sister's household, who wanted simply a door that locked, in a home where she had never before been given one room she could call entirely her own. This last category matters more than the legend of these hidden rooms usually allows, because it points towards something larger than any individual scandal, the sheer scarcity, in the domestic architecture of the period, of any space genuinely controlled by a woman rather than granted to her, conditionally, by the men who owned the house she lived in. Every bedroom a wife occupied in a Gilded Age mansion belonged, in the fullest legal and social sense, to her husband. Every room a daughter or an unmarried aunt occupied belonged to her father or her brother-in-law. The right to a door that locked and stayed locked against every other member of one's own household was not a right that domestic architecture of the period extended to women as a matter of course. It had to be built specifically and at considerable expense by a man willing to keep the arrangement secret from every other man in a woman's life. Calloway's 17 commissions taken together amount to a strange and largely invisible monument to this scarcity. 17 rooms scattered across the wealthiest households in America, each one representing a woman who had enough money, enough courage, and enough access to the right whispered recommendation to purchase quietly and at considerable risk something that should never have needed to be purchased at all. A space entirely her own, in a house that was never built by anyone else to give her one. It would be wrong to suggest that Calloway thought of his work in quite these terms, at least not in any language that survives among his papers. He was, as we have said, a professional above all else, a man who priced discretion and delivered it, and if he ever reflected on the larger social pattern his 17 commissions represented, he left no record of it beyond the plainest possible entries in a ledger meant to be read by no one but himself. And yet, the pattern exists, whether or not the man who built it ever named it, and it tells us something about the Gilded Age that no photograph of a marble staircase or a gilded ballroom ceiling could ever quite convey. That behind the visible splendour of these houses, in rooms too small and too well hidden to photograph at all, an entire generation of women were paying, in cash and in considerable secrecy, for the simple, ordinary dignity of a door only they could open. It is worth comparing this quiet, scattered pattern to the considerably more visible efforts of the period's small but growing movement for women's rights, since the two existed side by side, largely unaware of one another, addressing what was, at bottom, a related problem through entirely different means. The women who marched, petitioned, and wrote pamphlets that decade were arguing, in the most public possible register, for a broad and structural change in women's legal and political standing. Calloway's clients were pursuing something far narrower and more private. Not a change to the law, but a single physical door, purchased quietly, one household at a time, never intended to change anything beyond the four walls it was built within. Neither approach, considered alone, accomplished very much in the short term. The public movement met through the 1890s and into the new century, with a great deal of resistance and painfully slow progress. Calloway's private rooms accomplished even less in any lasting sense, each one eventually discovered, demolished, or simply forgotten, leaving no permanent change to the households that had briefly contained them. And yet there is something worth honouring in both efforts. The loud and the quiet, the public petition and the hidden room, each one a different register of the same underlying refusal to accept that a woman's life should be entirely accounted for by someone else. It is worth noting that at least 2 of Calloway's 17 clients appear, from the fragmentary record his ledger provides, to have quietly supported the public suffrage movement as well, contributing funds through channels separate from their household accounts in much the same careful, indirect manner they had used to pay for their hidden rooms. The overlap between these 2 forms of resistance, one conducted through architecture and one through organised political action, was likely considerably larger than the surviving evidence can confirm, since both required exactly the same kind of careful, undocumented financial manoeuvring that has left so little trace for historians to follow. This should not surprise us. A woman willing to spend a season's dress allowance on a hidden door was very likely also a woman capable of recognising, when the opportunity arose, a broader cause aimed at the same underlying problem, even if she pursued that cause as quietly and privately as she pursued her own architectural solution. History remembers the public campaigners, the marchers and the pamphleteers, considerably better than it remembers women like Margaret Hartwell, and this asymmetry of memory is itself worth noting since quiet, private resistance, however real, rarely earns the same recognition as resistance conducted in full public view. It is worth remembering too that Calloway's 17 commissions represent only the clients wealthy enough and connected enough through the right whispered recommendation to reach his particular door. Countless other women of the period, in households with less money or less access to this quiet network, wanted precisely the same thing Margaret Hartwell wanted, and had no comparable means of obtaining it at all, their longing for a room of their own left entirely unaddressed, unrecorded, and, in the vast majority of cases, unfulfilled for the whole of their lives. It is worth returning briefly to the question of what these 17 women might have accomplished with their considerable resources and evident determination had the same energy been available to them in a form the wider world could recognise and record. Several among them, judging by the intellectual curiosity evident in Margaret's own correspondence with Eleanor Ashford, possessed minds and interests that a later generation of women would have been permitted to pursue through university study, professional work, or public advocacy. Instead, that same capacity found its only outlet in the private, unrecorded, and ultimately temporary architecture of a hidden room. Let the 17 rooms rest together now, quietly, side by side in memory, each one small, each one plain, each one built for a longing that had nowhere else to go. You should let the weight of this settle gently, not as a grievance to carry into sleep, but simply as an understanding, the kind that arrives quietly and asks nothing further of you. 17 rooms, in 17 houses, most of them demolished now, their marble sold at auction, their ballrooms reduced to photographs in museum archives, and somewhere in the walls of the handful that still stand, if you knew exactly where to press, you might still find a panel that swings a little too easily, a seam in the plaster a fraction too smooth, the last quiet evidence of a trade that never had a name and a man who kept its every secret for the whole of his long, careful life. It is worth noting, finally, that a handful of these 17 rooms may still exist today, unknown even to their current owners, tucked behind panelling in the small number of Gilded Age houses that survived demolition through pure chance of location or preservation status, waiting, perhaps, for some future renovation to reveal what a careful hand once hid there. The ledger closes for the evening, 17 entries settled quietly back into the private drawer where they have rested for over a century now, waiting for no one in particular to find them again. Let the ledger's 17 entries settle back into their long undisturbed rest, each one a small private monument no one but Calloway himself was ever meant to read. It is worth noting, too, that Calloway's ledger includes, in its very last surviving page, a brief and uncharacteristically personal note, added sometime in his final working years, simply reading that he hoped whoever eventually read these pages would understand that every room in it had been built with care. It is the closest he ever came in any surviving document to explaining himself directly. The architect grows old. Calloway was 52 years old in the winter of 1905, and had by then begun to feel the particular fatigue that settles into a man who has spent 30 years holding alone the details of other people's most carefully guarded lives. He had never spoken a word of any of his 17 commissions to anyone, not to Susan, not to his 2 grown sons, not to the young men who had, over the years, apprenticed under him at his ordinary and entirely respectable firm, learning cornices and staircases the same way he himself had learned them, decades earlier, from a senior partner who had never once suspected what his careful, patient junior man would go on to build. This silence, maintained across 3 decades, had become, by his 50s, something closer to a physical habit than a conscious choice, the way a man who has walked with a limp long enough eventually stops noticing the particular adjustment his body makes with every step. Calloway carried the geography of 17 hidden rooms in his memory, the way another man might carry the layout of his childhood home, effortlessly, without strain, and yet the carrying of it, across so many years, had left its own quiet mark on him. A certain watchfulness in company, a habit of changing the subject smoothly whenever a dinner party conversation drifted toward the private lives of families he had once worked for. It is worth considering, at this point in the story, what Calloway himself gained from a life built so thoroughly around other people's secrets, since he gained, by any ordinary measure, remarkably little beyond the fee itself. He never used his particular skill for his own benefit, in any sense the historical record suggests. His own house, a comfortable but unremarkable brownstone he purchased with Susan in 1898, contained no hidden rooms of any kind, no secret passages, nothing beyond the ordinary architecture of a respectable upper-middle-class household. He had, in 3 decades of building doors that led to secret freedoms for other people's wives, apparently never once considered building anything of the kind for himself. This restraint, if restraint is even the right word for it, seems to have been less a matter of moral principle than of simple temperament. Calloway was not, by every surviving account, a man given to secrets of his own making. He kept other people's secrets with extraordinary care precisely because keeping secrets, for him, was a professional discipline rather than a personal inclination, a skill he exercised with the same detached competence a surgeon might bring to an operation on a patient he felt no particular emotional investment in beyond the desire to do the work correctly. And yet something in 3 decades of this work must have touched him more deeply than his professional detachment would suggest, because in 1904, a year before this chapter of our story finds him, Calloway did something he had never done before in the entire course of his private trade. He began, slowly and with evident reluctance, training a successor. The young man's name was Peter Voss, a junior draftsman at Calloway's firm who had shown, over several years of ordinary apprenticeship, the same unglamorous patience with detail that Calloway himself had once been noted for, a willingness to spend an entire afternoon working out the precise angle a flue needed to clear an adjoining chimney, tedious work that most young architects of ambition found beneath their interest, but that Voss, like Calloway before him, seemed to find genuinely absorbing. Calloway began, that year, bringing Voss along to certain meetings, introducing him not as an apprentice but as a colleague whose discretion could be entirely relied upon, a claim Calloway made carefully and only after nearly 2 years of quiet observation, watching the younger man's conduct in a dozen small situations that had nothing directly to do with hidden rooms, but that told Calloway everything he needed to know about a person's fundamental capacity for silence. He never fully explained to Voss why he was being introduced to this particular category of client, allowing the younger man to draw his own conclusions gradually, commission by commission, the way Calloway himself had once drawn his own conclusions working under a senior partner who preferred, on certain matters, never to explain anything directly at all. It was, in this sense, an apprenticeship conducted almost entirely through implication, a passing down of a trade that had no name, no guild, no written manual, only the accumulated judgment of a single careful man, transmitted slowly to a single careful successor. You might wonder what led Calloway, after 30 years of absolute and unbroken solitude in this particular work, to finally begin sharing it. The surviving evidence offers no direct answer, but it is worth noting that 1904 was also the year Calloway's own health first began to trouble him, a persistent cough that his physician attributed at the time to nothing more serious than the ordinary wear of age, but that would, within another 6 years, be diagnosed as the early stages of a lung disease that eventually claimed his life. Whether Calloway sensed, that year, some early intimation of his own mortality, and began, almost instinctively, to ensure that his particular skill would not simply vanish with him, taking the secrets of 17 households into a grave alongside it, is a question the record cannot answer with any certainty. What can be said with certainty is that by the time Calloway's health finally forced his full retirement, in the spring of 1909, Peter Voss had taken over 3 of his mentor's ongoing private commissions, including, as it happens, a modest addition to the Hartwell house's hidden room, a request Margaret Hartwell made through the same discreet channel of correspondence she had always used, unaware, as far as any record suggests, that the young man who arrived to survey the third-floor closet was not the same architect who had built it originally, but rather his carefully chosen successor, trained to the same exacting standard of silence. Calloway spent his final years in the brownstone with Susan, his sons grown and established in their own respectable, unremarkable careers, his private ledger locked, at last, in a drawer that he instructed in his will should be given entirely into Peter Voss's keeping upon his death, along with the folio of hand-drawn plans that no one outside his own family, and certainly no one from any of the 17 households recorded within it, ever learned had existed at all. He died in November of 1911, at the age of 58, of the lung disease that had troubled him for several years by then, in the upstairs bedroom of the brownstone, with Susan beside him and his sons summoned from their own households to say their farewells. His obituary, published in a modest paragraph in one of the city's smaller papers, described him accurately but incompletely as a respected architect associated with a number of well-regarded townhouses, credited him with no particular masterwork, and made no mention whatsoever of the 17 rooms that constituted, in the fullest and truest sense, the most important work of his entire career. Susan Calloway outlived her husband by nearly 2 decades, and the small collection of personal letters between them that survives, preserved by their eldest son and eventually donated to the same historical society that holds Mrs. Doyle's household diary, reveals a marriage considerably warmer than the business-like arrangement one might expect from a man so thoroughly devoted to the private lives of other people's households. Susan wrote, in a letter to a sister the year after Calloway's death, that her husband had been, whatever his professional reticence, an entirely open book to her, that he had told her, in his final year, more about his particular trade than he had ever told anyone else, across the whole of his working life, a confidence she chose in her own turn never to share with anyone beyond that single letter. It is a small, quiet grace note to end his story on, that the one person he had spent 30 years building privacy for other people, rather than himself finally, at the very end, allowed someone all the way in. Whatever he told her in those final months has been lost along with nearly everything else in this story, but the fact of the telling itself suggests a man who understood, better than most, the particular loneliness of holding too many secrets for too long, and who chose, when his own time grew short, not to carry every last one of them into the ground. Peter Voss attended the funeral, standing near the back of a modest gathering not unlike the one that would, decades later, mark Margaret Hartwell's own quiet ending, and inherited within the month the locked drawer of Calloway's private ledger and hand-drawn plans, exactly as his mentor's will had instructed. He would carry the trade forward for another 2 decades, adding his own commissions to the same careful shorthand Calloway had developed, training, in his own turn, a younger draftsman in the final years before the trade, itself dissolved entirely into a changed century. It is worth imagining for a moment the particular weight Voss must have felt, taking possession of that drawer, 17 households' worth of carefully guarded secrets passed into his sole keeping, along with the unspoken understanding that he now bore sole responsibility for a discretion that had taken his mentor a lifetime to build and had never once, in 30 years, been broken. He kept that responsibility as faithfully as Calloway had, and when his own time eventually came, he too found someone he trusted enough to pass it forward, a chain of careful men extending quietly, unrecorded, through the first decades of a century that would, before too long, have considerably less use for what they knew how to build. Calloway's final months were spent, according to Susan's own account, largely in quiet contentment despite his declining health, reading in the brownstone small study, receiving occasional visits from his now-grown sons and their own young families, and, on his better days, walking the few blocks to the bookshop above which he had once kept lodgings as a younger unmarried man, a small pilgrimage he made perhaps a dozen times in his final year, standing outside the building for a few minutes each time before turning quietly home. It is worth noting that Calloway's own sons, both of whom pursued respectable but entirely conventional careers, one in law and one in his father's own broader field of ordinary architecture, appear never to have suspected the particular nature of their father's most significant professional achievement, learning of the 17 hidden commissions only decades later, if at all, through the same scattered historical fragments that have allowed us to reconstruct this story tonight, their father's truest legacy remaining as invisible to his own children as it had been to everyone else during his lifetime. Let Calloway's stillness settle over you now, the particular calm of a man who built his whole life around never needing to be thanked for it. It is worth sitting with this for a moment, the particular quiet injustice of a life's finest achievement being also its most thoroughly hidden one, unknown even to the obituary writer who might otherwise have found, in 17 secret rooms built across 3 decades for 17 women seeking some small measure of freedom, a story considerably more interesting than the respectable townhouses that filled his public record instead. But this, in the end, was precisely the achievement itself, a lifetime of work so successfully concealed that even its own maker's death could not bring it fully into the light. Calloway had built, across 30 years, the most complete kind of privacy a house could offer, and in dying he simply extended that privacy quietly and without complaint to include himself. It is worth noting too that Peter Voss named his own eldest son Thomas, a small and quiet tribute that Calloway, had he lived to see it, would very likely have found more moving than any public acknowledgement his actual career had ever received. The brownstone grows quiet around this memory now, an ordinary evening in an ordinary home, its most extraordinary secret folded gently into the past where it belongs. Let the brownstone's lamps dim now one by one, the way lamps in any well-loved home eventually always do. It is worth noting too that Calloway's final commission, completed only months before his health forced his full retirement, was a modest addition to a house he had first worked on nearly 2 decades earlier, a small second room added to accommodate a client's aging mother who required in her final years a quiet space of her own within a household that had, by then, grown considerably larger and considerably louder than it had been when she was young. It seems a fitting final commission for a man who had spent his whole career building exactly this kind of quiet accommodation for people the rest of the house had stopped fully seeing. The turning of the century. Margaret Hartwell watched this larger world change around her from the particular vantage of a woman growing steadily older inside a house that had, in every visible respect, stopped changing at all. The marble stairs remained exactly as grand in 1915 as they had been in 1889. The dining room still sat 40 beneath its walnut panelling, but the world beyond the front door had begun, by the century's second decade, to shift in ways that even a household as insulated as the Hartwells could not entirely ignore. Her 3 children, grown by then into adulthood, occupied this changing world quite differently than she had occupied her own youth. Her eldest daughter, in particular, whose own coming of age coincided almost exactly with the final years of the suffrage campaign, took an interest in public causes that would have been almost unthinkable for a woman of Margaret's own generation, attending rallies, contributing to the campaign's considerable fundraising efforts, and speaking of the vote, when it finally arrived in 1920, with an unguarded excitement that Margaret found herself observing with a complicated mixture of pride and something closer to grief, a recognition of an entire different possible life that had simply come one generation too late for her. It would be a mistake, reading this, to imagine Margaret as a woman, embittered by the timing of her own life relative to her daughter's. The surviving letters between the 2 women, considerably warmer and more direct than anything that survives of Margaret's own relationship with her own mother, suggest instead a genuine and generous pleasure taken in her daughter's expanding possibilities, tempered by the quieter, private understanding, never stated outright in any letter that survives, that Margaret's own path toward whatever freedom she had managed to claim had required a hidden room and a decade of careful secrecy, while her daughter's generation could, at least in principle, claim similar freedoms in the open without an architect's discretion required at all. This is perhaps the truest measure of what changed across the turning of the century, considered from inside a single family rather than from the wider historical distance of the previous chapter. Not a sudden transformation, but a slow, generational handing down of possibility, each daughter inheriting a slightly wider version of the freedoms her mother had been forced to claim in secret, until the secrecy itself, the entire elaborate architecture of hidden rooms and disguised panels began to seem, to the daughters at least, like something belonging to an older and increasingly incomprehensible world. Margaret's own use of the hidden rooms slowed considerably through these final years, not because her need for solitude had diminished, but because the household itself had grown quieter around her. Her children departed to their own establishments, her husband's own health declining through the 1910s until his death in 1922 left her, for the first time in her adult life, the genuine and uncontested mistress of her own house, with no husband's schedule to accommodate, no reception calendar demanding a performance she needed occasional relief from. There is a particular irony worth sitting with here, that the hidden room, built specifically to offer Margaret a freedom her marriage denied her, became gradually less necessary in the very years when a more ordinary, visible freedom, widowhood, an empty house, a life finally and entirely her own to arrange, arrived to take its place. She visited the room perhaps once a month in her final decade rather than twice a week, according to the household diary. Her own housekeeper by then, Mrs. Doyle having long since retired, continued in the same careful, unremarkable tradition of noting only that the mistress was resting in her rooms, a phrase that had by this point largely returned to meaning exactly what it appeared to mean. The room itself in these final years became something closer to a keepsake than a necessity, a place Margaret visited not out of pressing need, but out of a kind of fond, deliberate remembering, sitting in the same green armchair, now considerably faded, rereading Eleanor Ashford's old letters on the anniversary of her friend's death each autumn, a small private ritual that Mrs. Doyle's successor, whoever she was, apparently never once remarked upon, or, if she noticed the pattern at all, chose to extend the same discretion her predecessor had always shown. It is worth understanding, considering this final chapter of the room's active use, that a space built for one specific and pressing purpose can, over the span of a long life, accumulate an entirely different set of meanings, the original urgent need for escape gradually softening into something closer to memory, a room valued now not for what it offered in the present moment, but for everything it had once made possible, decades earlier, when the need had been considerably more acute. You should let this softening settle into the pace of the story now, the way it settled into Margaret's own final years, the urgency of the earlier chapters giving way, gradually, to something quieter and more contented. She died, as we have already learned, in 1931 at 74, having lived to see a world considerably changed from the one her house had been built into, a world where her granddaughters would grow up assuming, as a matter of course, freedoms that had cost their grandmother a decade of careful secrecy and a hidden room behind a linen closet to claim even partially for herself. Her final years were, by every account that survives, contented ones, spent largely at the Fifth Avenue house, surrounded by grandchildren who knew her only as a warm, somewhat formal grandmother with a fondness for reading and an old green armchair, by then moved down from the third floor into her own sitting room that no one thought to ask the history of. She had, by the end, folded the room's entire meaning quietly into the rest of her life, its urgent original purpose long since resolved, its remaining significance carried gently, privately, in memory alone. It is a good way for a long life to end, this quiet folding in of an old necessity into simple, contented memory, and it is worth letting the same softening happen to the story itself now, as we move toward its final chapter. The urgency that opened this evening, a young wife wanting desperately a door that led somewhere her husband did not already control, has, by this point in her life, resolved into something gentler. An old woman, settled and at peace, remembering on occasion a room that had once meant everything, and now meant simply a fond and private piece of her own long history. It is worth noting, as we near the close of Margaret's own story, that she made a small provision in her will, easily overlooked among its larger bequests, leaving a modest sum to a historical society in Boston, with the simple, unexplained instruction that it be used to preserve correspondence of literary and intellectual interest. A bequest her family assumed reflected only her general love of reading, never once connecting it to the collection of Eleanor Ashford's letters that same society would decades later come to hold. It is worth noting one final detail about Margaret's later years, preserved in a brief mention within her daughter's own correspondence, that she took, in her final decade, to writing occasional unsent letters of her own, addressed to no one in particular, a habit her daughter noticed but never fully understood, finding a small stack of them after her mother's death, tucked among ordinary household papers, each one beginning with the same quiet salutation. And each one, her daughter recalled, somehow managing to sound as though it were being read rather than written. A private conversation continued long after its original correspondent had gone. Let Margaret's own long quiet life settle now into its final contented years, the urgency of youth resolved at last into the plainer, gentler satisfaction of having found, however briefly, a door of her own. This is perhaps the quietest and truest kind of progress a single life can measure, not a dramatic transformation, but a slow widening of what the next generation could simply assume without needing to fight or hide or build a secret passage for it at all. Margaret Hartwell's own contribution to this widening was never public, never celebrated, known to almost no one beyond a housekeeper, an architect, and a friend who died too young to see how the story eventually resolved. But it was real, in its own small and private way, and it deserves this evening to be remembered exactly as it was. Not a scandal, but a quiet, patient, decades-long act of claiming a little room of her own in a world that had never intended to give her one. It is worth noting, finally, that Margaret's own gravestone in the same Brooklyn cemetery where Calloway himself was buried 2 decades earlier bears only her name, her dates, and a single line her family chose from a poem she had once copied, in her own hand, onto a scrap of paper found among her private effects, its original source never identified, its meaning known only to her. The century turns quietly around her, and Margaret Hartwell, older now and entirely at peace, simply continues, for a little while longer yet, to live the long considered life she built for herself, one careful, private hour at a time. Let Margaret rest now too, in memory if nowhere else, her long life folding gently close the way every good story eventually must. It is worth noting, finally, that Margaret's obituary, published in a respectable but modest paragraph typical of the period, described her only as a devoted wife and mother, prominent in New York society for 4 decades, a description entirely accurate and entirely incomplete, saying nothing at all of the small room, the careful friendship, or the quiet, decades-long project of claiming some portion of her own life as genuinely hers. The season the rumours began. Let us step back a few years now, to the winter of 1899, a season that came closer than any other in this story, to becoming the scandal that legend would eventually assume it always was, though what actually happened, examined carefully, turns out to be considerably smaller and considerably more forgivable than the rumour it briefly resembled. Charles Hartwell had, by 1899, grown into late middle age comfortably, and without any particular change in the rhythms of his marriage, still occupied largely with business, still dining most evenings at his club, still entirely unaware of the 3rd-floor room he had unknowingly funded 8 years earlier. Margaret, by then 42, had settled into the particular use of the room that had defined it for most of the decade. An hour or 2 of solitude most weeks, the correspondence with Eleanor Ashford long since ended by her friend's death, replaced gradually by a quieter habit of simply reading, alone, in the green armchair that had by then faded slightly at the arms from years of use. The trouble began, as it so often does in households of this size, with nothing more dramatic than an overheard fragment of conversation, misunderstood by the person who overheard it, and repeated, with the small but significant distortions that gossip always introduces, to someone who had no particular reason to keep it to herself. A junior housemaid, newly hired that autumn, and not yet trained in the particular discretion the senior staff had long since internalised, happened to be dusting the nursery corridor one afternoon when she heard, through the wall, the faint sound of the linen closet's panels swinging shut, followed by silence where she had expected to find, upon investigation a few minutes later, an empty closet and no explanation whatsoever for the sound. She mentioned this, that same evening, to a friend employed in a neighbouring household, in the casual, unthinking way that young servants sometimes did before they had fully learned the cost of such carelessness, and the friend, delighted by even the smallest fragment of gossip about a family as prominent as the Hartwells, repeated it to her own mistress's lady's maid, who repeated it, in turn, to a friend of hers who happened to know, socially, one of the younger women in Margaret Hartwell's own circle. By the time the story reached this final listener, some 3 or 4 retellings removed from its original and entirely innocent source, it had transformed considerably, as such stories always do, from a housemaid's puzzlement over an unexplained sound into something considerably more pointed. A suggestion, never stated outright but clearly implied in the careful, delighted way such things were always implied in that world. That Mrs. Hartwell kept a secret room somewhere in her house, and that a secret room, in a woman of her position, could really mean only one thing. The rumour reached Margaret herself in the most indirect way possible, through a comment made, apparently in perfect innocence, by a woman at a luncheon that January, who mentioned, in the course of an entirely unrelated conversation about a mutual acquaintance's redecorated drawing room, that she had heard the Hartwell house contained the most curious hidden nooks, quite the talk of certain circles that season. The comment was made lightly, almost as a compliment to the house's architectural interest, and the woman who made it had, as far as any record suggests, no idea whatsoever of the actual substance behind the rumour she was casually repeating. Margaret's response, recorded only in a brief and carefully worded entry in her own private diary that survives among family papers, was to smile, agree that the house did indeed have some interesting architectural features, and change the subject with the same practised ease she had spent 2 decades cultivating as a hostess. But she left the luncheon that afternoon, according to the diary entry, with what she described only as a considerable unease, and went that same evening not to the hidden room itself but to Mrs. Doyle, requesting a private conversation in her own sitting room after the household had otherwise retired. What passed between the 2 women in that conversation is not directly recorded, but its consequences are. Within the week, the junior housemaid who had overheard the closet's panel was quietly dismissed, given a generous reference and a sum of money considerably beyond what her brief tenure would ordinarily have warranted, and sent, according to Mrs. Doyle's household diary, to a position with a family in Philadelphia that Mrs. Doyle herself had arranged through her own private network of contacts, a transfer completed with such smooth and unremarkable efficiency that no one else in the household thought to question it as anything beyond an entirely ordinary staffing change. You should notice, in this small episode, the entire architecture of discretion we discussed several chapters ago operating exactly as it was designed to operate, not through any single dramatic confrontation, but through a series of small, unremarkable adjustments. A dismissed housemaid here, a changed subject at a luncheon there, each one so minor on its own that no observer could have pieced together, from any single moment, the larger pattern of protection they collectively formed. Mrs. Doyle, in arranging the housemaid's transfer, never once acknowledged to Margaret or to anyone that she understood precisely what she was protecting. She simply protected it, efficiently and without comment, the way she had protected it, in smaller ways, for 8 years already. The rumour itself, deprived of its original source and never confirmed by anyone with direct knowledge of the room's actual purpose, faded within a season, the way most society gossip of this kind eventually faded, replaced by newer and more interesting subjects as the winter social calendar produced, as it always did, a fresh supply of scandals both real and imagined for New York's drawing rooms to discuss. By the following autumn, the whispered suggestion about the Hartwell house's curious hidden nooks had been almost entirely forgotten, remembered, if at all, as nothing more than one of the countless minor rumours that circulated briefly through society each season, and left no lasting mark on anyone's reputation. Margaret herself, in the diary entry that records this entire episode, reflects on it with a composure that seems, reading it now, remarkable, given how close the rumour had actually come to something considerably more damaging than she likely ever fully realised. She writes only that the matter has been resolved satisfactorily, that she is grateful for Mrs. Doyle's good sense, and that she intends, going forward, to be somewhat more careful about the hours she chooses to visit her private room, a resolution the record suggests she largely kept, spacing her visits more unpredictably across the following years, and taking care, always afterward, to check that the nursery corridor was entirely empty before approaching the closet at all. It is tempting to imagine this episode as the story's dramatic centre, the moment when discovery nearly arrived and disaster was narrowly averted, and a different kind of narration might well tell it that way, building tension through the housemaid's overheard sound, the gossip's slow spread, the anxious luncheon conversation, before releasing that tension in the housemaid's quiet dismissal. But this is not, in truth, how the episode felt to the people who lived through it, and it is not how we should carry it into Sleep Tonight. For Margaret Hartwell, the entire affair unfolded not as drama, but as a series of small, manageable adjustments, handled with the same practical composure she brought to every other challenge of running a household this size, resolved quietly, without confrontation, and largely forgotten within the year. The dismissed housemaid herself, it's worth noting, appears to have gone on to a perfectly ordinary and reasonably content life in her new Philadelphia position, according to the one further fragment of information Mrs. Doyle's network of contacts preserved, a brief note exchanged between housekeepers some years later, mentioning that the girl had married a tradesman and left service altogether, entirely unaware, as far as anyone can tell, of the particular reason her transfer had been arranged with such uncharacteristic speed and generosity all those years before. This too is worth sitting with, gently, before we move on. That the entire small crisis resolved itself not through any harm done to anyone, but through a quiet redirection, a young woman sent toward a life that suited her every bit as well as the one she left, her own story continuing, unharmed and unaware, alongside the larger story she had briefly and unknowingly threatened to unravel. It is worth noting, too, how differently this small crisis might have resolved in a household with a less experienced or less loyal housekeeper. Domestic service of this period was full of stories, considerably darker than anything that happened at the Hartwell house, of servants dismissed without reference over far smaller suspicions, sometimes on evidence no stronger than a rumour, their futures damaged permanently by an accusation that was never proven, and often never even stated aloud. Mrs. Doyle's handling of the situation, generous, practical, and entirely without cruelty toward a young woman who had, after all, done nothing wrong beyond a moment's ordinary indiscretion, represents a kind of quiet decency that the historical record of domestic service does not always credit its senior staff with possessing. This decency mattered enormously to the housemaid's own life, even if she never fully understood what she had been protected from, and it mattered too to the larger shape of this story, since a different housekeeper, a harsher or more anxious one, might have handled the same discovery in a way that ended very differently for everyone involved, Margaret included. The entire architecture of privacy we have traced through this evening, physical and social both, depended finally on individual human choices made by individual people in individual moments, and Mrs. Doyle's choice, in this particular moment, was a generous one. It is worth noting too how the entire episode reshaped, in small but lasting ways, the household's daily rhythms going forward. Mrs. Doyle instituted, without ever explaining her reasoning to anyone, a new and stricter protocol for training incoming junior staff, an additional week added to every new servant's orientation specifically devoted to the household's expectations around discretion, a change that outlasted Margaret's own tenure as mistress of the house, and that Mrs. Doyle's own successor continued without ever fully understanding its original purpose. It is worth noting, finally, that Margaret herself never learned precisely how close the rumour had come to its true source, Mrs. Doyle having handled the entire matter with such discretion that even her employer understood only the barest outline of what had actually occurred. This too was a form of protection, extended not only to Margaret's secret but to Margaret's own peace of mind, sparing her the fuller anxiety a complete accounting of the crisis might have caused. Let the small crisis close now, gently, the way it closed for everyone who lived through it, without harm, without exposure, simply folded back into the ordinary business of a household continuing. Let the tension of this chapter dissolve now, the way it dissolved for Margaret herself, into the ordinary and unremarkable business of a household continuing exactly as it always had. 30 servants going about their duties, a hostess resuming her Tuesday afternoons of solitude with only slightly more caution than before, a rumour fading into the general and forgettable noise of a season's gossip, until nothing remained of it at all except a single diary entry, and the memory, known only to 2 women, of how close an ordinary Thursday luncheon had come to unravelling a secret 8 years in the keeping. It is worth noting, finally, that Charles Hartwell, dining at his club the same week the rumour briefly circulated, apparently heard a garbled version of it himself, mentioned in passing by an acquaintance, and dismissed it without a second thought as the sort of nonsense idle society gossip always produced about prominent families, never once connecting it to his own household at all. The luncheon guests have long since gone home, their idle comment about curious hidden nooks forgotten along with everything else said that particular afternoon, and the house settles back into its usual undisturbed quiet. Let the whole small forgotten crisis settle finally into nothing more than a single line in an old diary, harmless now, resolved now, entirely at rest. It is worth noting, too, that Margaret's diary entry recording the entire episode ends with a single line that has puzzled the few researchers who have read it. A brief remark that she found herself, that particular evening, unexpectedly grateful for a house with so many walls, a sentence that could be read as simple relief or as something considerably more layered, depending on how closely one has followed the rest of her story. When the house changed hands. Margaret Hartwell lived a long life by the standards of her generation, dying in 1931 at the age of 74 in the same Fifth Avenue house she had moved into as a young bride 42 years earlier, having outlived her husband by nearly a decade and watched from the particular vantage of old age the entire world that had built her house dissolve gradually into something considerably less grand and considerably less certain of itself. The house passed, upon her death, to her eldest son, who had little interest in maintaining a household of 30 servants in a decade when such households had become, for reasons both economic and social, an increasingly impractical extravagance, and who sold the Fifth Avenue mansion within 2 years to a real estate concern that had, by then, purchased a number of similar properties along the avenue, most of them destined for demolition and replacement, with the kind of apartment building that could house on the same footprint 40 or 50 families instead of one. The demolition crew that arrived in the spring of 1934 worked through the house methodically, floor by floor, the marble staircase that had once accommodated 400 guests reduced, within a matter of weeks, to rubble carted away for salvage, the walnut panelling of the dining room sold to a dealer who specialised in architectural salvage for considerably less than its original cost. The ballroom's painted ceiling, that allegory of commerce and abundance the newspapers had once admired, simply broken apart and discarded, its subject matter having outlived by several decades any market's interest in preserving it. It was during this demolition, according to a brief and largely overlooked notice that appeared in a trade publication for the construction industry that summer, that a foreman supervising the third floor's removal discovered, behind what he described in his report only as an unusually solid section of wall near the old nursery, a small room, empty by then of any furniture, containing nothing but a faded green stain on the floor where an armchair had evidently stood for many years, and a shallow drawer, built into the base of what had once been a writing desk, still fitted into the wall itself, containing a small bundle of letters tied with ribbon that had, by then, faded to a colour no one present could confidently name. The foreman, a practical man with no particular interest in the domestic history of a house he had been hired to demolish, rather than to preserve, glanced through several of the letters, found them to be, as he described them, personal correspondence of no evident value, and set them aside with the general debris of the demolition, where they were very likely discarded along with the rest of the third floor's remains within another day or two, their contents, whatever precisely they contained, lost to any historical record beyond the foreman's brief and incurious mention of them in a report otherwise concerned entirely with structural matters and salvage values. You should sit for a moment with the particular quiet tragedy of this discovery. A bundle of letters that had once mattered enormously to at least one person, kept for decades in a hidden drawer, treated, in its final moments of existence, with no more ceremony than a foreman's passing curiosity, before being swept away with plaster dust and broken lath. It is very likely, though the record cannot confirm it with any certainty, that these letters were the last of Eleanor Ashford's correspondence, the small archive Margaret had kept for 40 years in the room's locked drawer, ending its existence not in any dramatic revelation, but in the utterly unremarkable indifference of a demolition crew working through their afternoon quota. The room itself survived only a few days longer than the letters. Its walls opened fully to the demolition crew's tools within the week, its false panel and concealed hinge, so carefully fitted by Calloway more than 4 decades earlier, reduced to splintered lumber indistinguishable from the rest of the third floor's remains. By the following month, the entire Hartwell mansion had been cleared to its foundation, and within the year an apartment building rose in its place, 11 stories of considerably more modest but considerably more numerous homes, none of their occupants ever aware of the particular history the ground beneath them had once contained. This pattern, A hidden room built with enormous care and then destroyed with almost total indifference decades later, repeats itself through nearly every one of Calloway's 17 commissions, as far as any surviving record allows us to trace their eventual fates. The Newport Garden Folly survived somewhat longer, preserved as an ornamental feature by successive owners who valued its picturesque appearance without ever suspecting its second door, before finally succumbing, in the 1960s, to a hurricane that damaged the structure beyond practical repair. Its rear panel, by then long since painted shut and forgotten by everyone still living, discovered only during the salvage crew's final inspection, and noted in the brief report that survives, with the same passing incurious interest the Hartwell foreman had shown decades earlier. It is worth asking, considering this pattern, what precisely was lost in each of these demolitions, beyond the physical structures themselves. A hidden room, once discovered and destroyed, becomes almost impossible to recover, as history in any meaningful sense, its purpose known, if at all, only through the kind of fragmentary evidence, ledgers, diary entries, letters preserved by chance rather than by design, that this story has been reconstructed from at every turn. Most of the 17 rooms in Calloway's private ledger left no trace of this kind at all. Their existence, their purpose, the particular freedoms they offered the women who used them, entirely lost to history the moment the buildings that contained them were cleared away. The Hartwell house's own hidden room survives in the historical record at all only because of a handful of fortunate accidents. Mrs. Doyle's household diary, donated by a descendant to a historical society decades later, the foreman's brief and largely overlooked trade publication notice, and a small collection of Eleanor Ashford's own surviving letters, preserved not by Margaret's side of the correspondence, which was lost with the room itself, but by Eleanor's own family, who kept her outgoing correspondence with considerably more care than the Hartwell demolition crew showed the letters that came back the other way. It is from this thin, accidental archive, 3 or 4 sources that happen to survive out of what must once have been a considerably larger body of evidence, that we have reconstructed this evening the whole of Margaret Hartwell's quiet, private history, a room built for solitude, a friendship conducted almost entirely on paper, 20 minutes of silence stolen from the middle of a January ball, a near discovery resolved through a housekeeper's quiet efficiency, and finally an ending as unremarkable and unceremonious as the ordinary demolition of an ordinary building, its most private contents swept away with the rest of the debris by men who had no reason to know and no particular interest in learning what they were actually discarding. Margaret herself did not live to see this final demolition, having died 3 years before the wrecking crew arrived, and there is a small mercy in that timing, however you choose to weigh it. She never had to watch the room dismantled, never had to learn what became of Eleanor's letters, never had to see the marble staircase she had climbed as a young bride reduced to rubble, carted away by men who had no idea whose feet had once worn its tread smooth. Her own memory of the room, preserved intact until her final years, remained exactly what she had always known it to be, a private sanctuary that had served her faithfully for 4 decades, its eventual fate a matter she was spared from ever having to witness. Her son, settling her estate in the 2 years between her death and the house's sale, found nothing in his mother's papers to suggest the room's existence at all, Margaret having long since stopped keeping any written record that might have led an heir to it, trusting in her final years to memory alone and to the simple fact that a room so carefully hidden required no further protection once its only regular occupant had stopped needing it. It is worth wondering gently whether Margaret ever considered telling one of her own daughters about the room before her death, passing the secret forward the way Calloway had passed his trade forward to Voss. The surviving letters offer no evidence that she did, and it is tempting to read this silence as a final, deliberate choice, a decision that the room's purpose had been served entirely within her own lifetime, and that her daughters, coming of age in a considerably wider world, would have no need of the particular solution their mother had required. Whether this was wisdom, or simply an oversight born of old age and failing energy, the record cannot say. What can be said is that the room died with her, in every meaningful sense, 3 years before the physical structure itself was finally cleared away, its last living witness carrying its full history into a grave in the same Brooklyn cemetery, coincidentally, where Calloway himself had been laid to rest 2 decades earlier, the architect and his client resting unknowingly within a few hundred yards of one another, the last two people alive who had ever fully understood what that small third-floor room had actually been for. The apartment building that eventually rose on the site included, in its original 1935 advertisements, preserved in a newspaper archive, no mention whatsoever of the grand house that had once occupied the same footprint, describing the location only in terms of its convenient position and modern amenities, electric refrigeration, steam heat, the practical comforts of a new century entirely uninterested in the marble palace it had replaced. It is worth noting, too, that the trade publication which briefly recorded the foreman's discovery folded entirely within a decade, its own archives scattered and partially lost during a subsequent office relocation, meaning that even this thin thread of evidence survived only by the narrowest of margins, a single surviving bound volume, water-damaged along one edge, discovered decades later in a university library's storage annex by a researcher pursuing an entirely unrelated question about labour practices in 1930s demolition work. Let the marble dust settle now, the way it settled that spring over a street that had already, by then, half forgotten what had once stood there. Let this settle now, the particular melancholy of history's near-total indifference to the private lives it could have preserved, and almost never did. Somewhere beneath an apartment building on Fifth Avenue, in ground that has been built over and rebuilt over again in the 90 years since, the last trace of a woman's small, hard-won freedom has long since dissolved into the ordinary soil of the city, unmarked, unremembered by anyone who walks above it now, and yet no less real, for all that, than it ever was, in the years when it mattered most to the one person it was ever built for. It is worth noting, too, that the apartment building's original tenants, moving into their new units in 1935, were given, as a promotional gesture, a small printed history of the block dating back only to the building's own construction, its previous 90 years of use compressed into a single dismissive sentence about a large residence once located on the site. The rubble has long since been cleared away, the foundation poured anew, and 11 stories of ordinary apartments now stand where a hidden room once kept its careful watch over a woman's few private hours. Let the new building's lights come on now floor by floor, an ordinary evening beginning in rooms that carry no memory at all of what once stood beneath them. It is worth noting, too, that a handful of similar Fifth Avenue mansions did survive this era of demolition, preserved not out of any particular historical reverence, but because they happened to be converted, cheaply and without much alteration, into private clubs or foreign consulates, institutions with less pressure to maximize the square footage of their real estate than an ordinary residential developer. It is within a small number of these surviving structures that architectural historians have, on rare occasions, stumbled across features uncannily similar to what we have described tonight, panels that seem to serve no obvious purpose, corridors that lead nowhere anyone can quite explain. It is worth one final note on the demolition itself, that the wrecking crew's foreman, in the same brief trade publication notice that recorded his discovery of the hidden room, mentioned also, almost as an aside, that the whole job had taken 6 weeks longer than estimated, the old house proving, in its final act, considerably more stubborn to unmake than anyone had expected a building of its age to be. What the walls remember. Very little remains, in any physical sense, of the world we have walked through tonight. The Hartwell mansion is gone, replaced by an apartment building that has itself, by now, stood for nearly a century, home to families who have no idea what quiet history the ground beneath their radiators once held. The Newport Folly is gone too, taken by a storm decades after anyone still living could have told you what its rear panel once concealed. Calloway himself has been gone for well over a century, his grave in a modest Brooklyn cemetery marked with a stone that records only his name and dates. No mention anywhere of the 17 rooms that constituted the truest work of his careful, private life. And yet something of this world persists, if you know how to look for it, in the handful of great houses that do still stand, preserved now as museums, their public rooms open to visitors who move slowly through ballrooms and dining halls, admiring the marble and the gilding exactly as their original architects intended. Walk one of these houses today, and a docent will tell you a great deal about proportion and provenance, about which quarry supplied which marble, about the family who once entertained 400 guests beneath a painted ceiling. What the docent will very likely never mention, because the museum's own records rarely preserve it, is the other house, running invisibly behind the one you're being shown, the narrow corridors, the disguised panels, the small plain rooms built for purposes that left no photograph and, in most cases, no written record at all. This is not a failure of any particular museum or historian, it is simply the nature of what we have been discussing tonight, an architecture built from its very first sketch to leave no trace. A house designed to be seen leaves abundant evidence of itself, in photographs, in newspaper coverage, in the careful documentation that accompanies any building considered significant enough to preserve. A house designed to be unseen leaves almost nothing by design, and what little it does leave survives only through the kind of accident we traced this evening. A housekeeper's diary that happened to be kept, a foreman's brief notice that happened to be published, a bundle of letters that happened to travel one direction rather than the other before the demolition crew arrived. You should understand, letting this settle, that for every story like Margaret Hartwell's that survives even this fragmentary reconstruction, there were very likely dozens more that left no trace whatsoever, women across every great house of the period who found, or tried to find, some small measure of the same privacy, working with architects less careful than Calloway, or none at all, in rooms that were discovered, or torn down, or simply forgotten, without leaving behind even the thin archive that has let us walk through this particular house tonight. There is something worth sitting with, in this quiet, uncounted multitude, this larger and entirely unrecorded history of women, finding small doors in large houses built, in almost every other respect, to leave them none. It is not a story of villainy on the whole, not a story of husbands to be condemned or wives to be judged, though individual cruelties and individual betrayals certainly occurred within it, as they occur within any sufficiently large collection of human lives. It is, more simply, a story about the particular scarcity of a single ordinary thing, a room that belonged, without condition or explanation required, to the person occupying it, and about how far some women were willing to go, and how much they were willing to pay, to purchase something that should never have needed to be purchased at all. Calloway understood this, in his own quiet and undramatic way, better than almost anyone else of his generation, not because he theorized about it in any letter or diary that survives, but because he built it 17 times in 17 different houses, each one a small and largely unremembered correction to an architecture that had otherwise been designed, almost without anyone intending it, around the assumption that a woman's life required no door she alone could open. You're walking tonight through the very last of this particular corridor, the third-floor passage that once connected a linen closet to a servant's stair, now nothing more than open air 11 stories above a city street, the walls that once concealed it long since carted away, sold for scrap, or simply crushed beneath the foundations of whatever building eventually replaced it. There is nothing left to find here, in the strictest physical sense, and yet you have walked it anyway this evening, in the only way it can still be walked, through the fragments that happen to survive, assembled carefully and carried gently into the particular quiet of your own room tonight. Let the corridor grow fainter now. Let the gas jet that has guided you this far burn a little lower and lower still, until the passage ahead is more felt than seen, a memory of a memory, the last trace of a house that stopped existing nearly a century ago, and of a woman who wanted more than anything else her considerable fortune could provide her, simply an hour, twice a week, that belonged entirely to herself. Somewhere in the walls of the handful of Gilded Age houses that do still stand, this same quiet architecture is very likely still waiting, undiscovered, unremarked upon, in a panel that swings a fraction too easily, a seam in the plaster a fraction too smooth, a closet whose lock is a fraction more substantial than its stated purpose would require. You do not need to find it tonight. You do not need to find anything at all. You need only rest here, in the last quiet corridor of a story that was always, at its heart, about the simple, difficult art of finding a little rest of one's own, in a world that so rarely offered it freely. Consider, one final time, everyone who passed through this story tonight, and let each of them settle gently into memory before you release them entirely. Calloway, who built 17 doors for other people, and never once thought to build one for himself. Margaret, who wanted only an hour, twice a week, that belonged to no one but her. Eleanor, who found, in letters exchanged with a woman she rarely met in person, the particular companionship her own solitary life so rarely offered elsewhere. Mrs. Doyle, who saw everything and said nothing, for reasons that had everything to do with survival and, perhaps, a little to do with quiet loyalty as well. Samuel, who cared only that the hinge swung true. Peter Voss, who carried the whole careful trade forward into a century that would, before too long, have no further use for it. None of them knew, as far as we can tell, how their small part of this story would eventually be told, gathered up a century later from scattered ledgers and diaries and letters, assembled into a single evening's quiet company for someone they never met and never could have imagined listening. And yet here you are, carrying all of them gently now into whatever rest tonight has waiting for you. Think, if you like, of every quiet room you have ever claimed as your own, however briefly, however small. A childhood reading nook, a parked car on a long drive, radio low, nowhere in particular to be, the chair by your own window, late at night, when the rest of the house has gone to sleep and the hour finally, briefly, belongs to no one else's schedule but yours. These are the same room, in the end, wherever and whenever they occur. The same simple human need, finding whatever door happens to be available to it. You have that door tonight too, wherever you are listening from. You do not need a hidden panel or a false-backed closet to find it. You need only let your eyes stay closed, your breathing stay slow, and the last of this old house's many corridors fold quietly closed behind you, the way every good door in this story eventually did, without complaint, without ceremony, simply finished with the evening it was built to hold. Consider, too, how strange it is that a story this quiet, this thoroughly undramatic by the standards of most history that gets remembered, should have survived at all, pieced together from a housekeeper's dutiful diary, a foreman's passing curiosity, a widow's carefully kept correspondence. Most private histories leave no such trail. That this one did, however thin, feels almost like its own small grace, the story insisting faintly on being told, long after everyone who lived it had gone. There is a particular kind of grace in this near loss, worth acknowledging before we close, the recognition that most of what makes up a human life, however carefully lived, however quietly meaningful, simply does not survive the passage of a century, and that what we have managed to recover here, this one evening's careful reconstruction, represents an exception rather than a rule, a small mercy of accidental preservation, rather than any guarantee that private lives, however rich, will be remembered at all. Let every room in this story close now, one after another quietly, the way good doors always close, without complaint, without ceremony. The house is settling now, the way old houses always settle, in small, patient sounds you can barely distinguish from silence itself. Let your own body settle the same way. Let the weight of the evening, the marble stairs and the painted ceilings and the narrow servants' passages, all of it, dissolve gently into the particular darkness of your own room, until nothing remains of tonight's house except the last, faintest impression of a door, somewhere behind a wall, closing softly and staying closed exactly as it was always meant to. It is worth noting, finally, that if you were to visit this same address today, you would find nothing to suggest any of tonight's story ever happened here at all, only an ordinary lobby, an ordinary elevator, ordinary mail slots bearing ordinary names, the entire history we have spent this evening reconstructing folded now into nothing more than the ground itself. The corridor behind you has gone entirely dark now, and there is nothing more to see here, only the quiet, settled feeling of a story that has finally finished telling itself. Let the last of this evening's corridor dissolve now gently into the wider and more familiar darkness of your own room. It is worth noting too that no marker, plaque or public record anywhere in the city today acknowledges any part of tonight's story. No small bronze plate on the sidewalk, no mention in any historical walking tour. The entire narrative existing now only in scattered archives and, for this one evening, in the quiet space between these words and your own settling thoughts. The corridor is empty now, the gas jet has gone out on its own, the way it always eventually does, and the dark that remains is not frightening, only soft, only complete, the particular dark of a very old house at the very end of a very long evening. Somewhere below, the clock that began this story is still finishing its hours, quietly, patiently, the way it has finished every hour for longer than anyone now living can remember. You do not need to count them. You do not need to do anything at all now, except let your breathing settle into the same slow, unhurried rhythm the house itself has always kept. The marble stairs are cool and empty. The ballroom is dark. The small room behind the linen closet, wherever its walls have gone, has closed for the last time, softly, the way a good door always closes, without complaint, without ceremony, simply finished with the evening it was built to hold. Let yourself go now. There is nowhere else in this house you need to be, and nothing left in this story that requires your waking attention. Rest here, in the last quiet corridor, where the only sound left is your own breath. Slower now, softer now, folding gently into sleep. Thank you so much for watching. If you'd like to see more videos like this, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel. It really helps us keep making more content. See you in the next one. If you liked this video, let me know where in the world you're watching from and what time it is. I'm always curious about that. And if you have a suggested topic, feel free to leave it in the comments.